Picture a woman standing in the middle of one of the greatest civilizations ever built. Around her, people are constructing monuments that will still be standing in 4,000 years. Scholars are writing medical texts that physicians will reference for centuries. Architects are designing temples with such mathematical precision that modern engineers are still arguing about how they did it. Farmers are managing the flooding of the largest river on Earth with a sophistication that took the rest of the world 1,000 years to match. Now picture what she's doing right now, today, this particular morning. She's trying to solve a problem that has nothing to do with pyramids or philosophy or the movement of stars. She's bleeding. It's the second day, which means the heaviest day, and she has to work. She has to move through her life. She has to show up. And in the year 1550 BCE, in the city of Thebes, on the banks of the Nile, she has roughly 3 available options, none of them good, all of them requiring ingenuity and physical discomfort, and a kind of practical problem-solving that never made it into the history books because nobody, for most of recorded history, thought this was worth writing down. That right there is what tonight is actually about. Not just the object, not just the invention, but the silence around it. The thousands of years of women managing a monthly biological reality with whatever they could find, whatever worked, whatever was available, and doing it quietly, invisibly, without complaint and without record, because that was what was expected of them. That was what was required. Show up, work, bleed in secret, get on with it. I make these history stories, and honestly, every time I research one of these topics, I end up sitting there at my desk at 2 a.m. going, how did nobody write about this? But this one in particular, this one is genuinely astounding. Because we have papyrus scrolls from 1550 BCE describing medical treatments in extraordinary detail. We have texts from ancient Rome describing surgical procedures. We have medieval manuscripts discussing everything from the behavior of comets to the optimal fermentation time for wine. But finding a direct, honest, practical description of how ordinary women managed menstruation through most of human history, that required archaeology. That required reading between the lines of texts written mostly by men who considered this topic beneath mention. That required finding the scraps and hints and passing references and stitching them together into something that actually made sense. And what you find when you do that work is one of the longest running improvisational projects in human history. Thousands of years of women solving the same problem over and over again, with different materials in different cultures, under different levels of restriction and shame and practical constraint, usually without any help from the people around them, often under explicit instruction not to mention it at all. So, get comfortable. This is going to take a while, and this is the kind of history that will change how you think about a lot of things. Here we go. You're in Thebes. The year is somewhere around 1550 BCE, which means you are living at the height of the new kingdom of ancient Egypt. This is not a small place. This is not a provincial backwater. Thebes at this moment is arguably the most powerful city in the known world, the capital of an empire that stretches from the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south to the Levant in the north. The temples here are so large that the entire island of Cyprus could fit inside the precinct of Karnak. The population numbers in the hundreds of thousands. The administrative machinery required to run this empire is staggeringly sophisticated. Scribes and tax collectors and military commanders and grain administrators and priests and physicians, all operating within a bureaucracy that makes most modern governments look like they're running on napkin calculations. And you are a weaver, You work in one of the royal workshops, which are essentially large production facilities operating under the direct authority of the temple or the palace, depending on which workshop and which era you're in. You make linen. Good linen, possibly very fine linen, the kind Egypt is famous for exporting across the Mediterranean, the kind that wealthy Greeks and Romans will within a few centuries pay extraordinary prices to get. The Egyptian linen industry is one of the economic engines of this civilization, and your hands are part of it. The workshop opens early. It opens when the light is still thin, and the Nile air still carries that particular morning coolness that evaporates so quickly once the sun gets going. You know this coolness. You know what it smells like. The mud, the water, the faint green vegetable smell of papyrus growing along the bank, the more animal smell of the workshop itself, which holds maybe 60 women on a busy day, their bodies close together, the air thickening steadily through the morning as the temperature climbs. Your fingers know the thread before your eyes are fully open. That's the level of mastery required. The warp threads on the horizontal loom are fine enough to catch on rough skin, and your hands have learned to move with a particular softness, almost a hovering, that keeps the linen clean and even. You have calluses in specific places, the pads of your index finger and thumb on your right hand, a particular ridge along your left palm from gripping the shuttle. Your hands are working hands. Strong hands, hands that know exactly what they're doing. And this morning, while those hands are doing what they always do, another part of your body is doing something else entirely. And when I say the second day is the heaviest day, I need you to understand what that means without modern infrastructure. No bathroom down the hall, no paper products, no plumbing in any meaningful sense. The workshop doesn't have a private space for dealing with this. There's a latrine area, essentially, around the back of the building, screened by a wall, and that's what you've got. What you've prepared the night before because you know your own cycle well enough by now to anticipate it, is a length of old linen. Worn linen, soft from washing, cut into a strip, folded a particular way, held in place by your undergarment, which is itself a wrapped length of cloth, nothing like modern underwear, more of an arranged system of fabric that can be adjusted. This works, more or less. It is uncomfortable. It requires adjustment that you've gotten good at making invisibly, without drawing attention. You know which movements might disturb the arrangement. You know when you need to make a quiet detour to the latrine area. You've been doing this since you were about 13 years old, and you are now, by any reasonable estimate, somewhere in your late 20s, which means you've been managing this problem for going on 15 years, and you're genuinely expert at managing it. But today, something is different. Because today there's a physician visiting the workshop. He's here for something else entirely. One of the older weavers has a problem with her eyes, a clouding that's been getting worse, and the workshop overseer has arranged a consultation. The physician is a young man, maybe 30, with the particular self-possession of someone who has studied at one of the great temple medical schools and knows it. He carries a wooden case. He has an assistant who carries a more complex kit. He's competent. He is, by the standards of 1550 BCE, a genuinely impressive medical professional. His name doesn't matter for our purposes, but what matters is what's in the case he carries, and what's in the scrolls back at his school, and what those scrolls say about the problem you're currently managing. Because here is something that most people don't know, something that surprises people when they hear it. The ancient Egyptians had a word for the internal management of menstrual flow. They had a description of a technique. It's in the Ebers papyrus, one of the oldest and most comprehensive medical documents we've ever found. written around 1550 BCE, which is right now, which is the world you're currently living in. The Ebers papyrus runs to nearly 100 pages of medical text. It describes treatments for everything from crocodile bites to intestinal parasites to eye problems. It is, in its way, a work of extraordinary practical medicine, and buried in it, in language that took scholars decades to properly translate and understand, is a description of soft, moistened papyrus used as internal menstrual protection. Papyrus. The same material the scrolls are written on. The plant that grows in absolute abundance along the Nile, that Egypt exports in massive quantities, that is so central to Egyptian civilization that the word for papyrus essentially becomes the root word for paper in Greek, which becomes our word paper. That papyrus. The plant you've walked past 10,000 times. The plant your brother uses to make sandals. The plant the scribes use to write down everything worth writing down. It can also be softened, formed, and used this way. The physician who is visiting your workshop today knows this. It's in his training. Whether he would ever mention it, whether this information flows from the medical school to the women who actually need it, that's a different question. That's the question that defines most of the history we're going to cover tonight. The gap between what was known and what was communicated. The gap between the medical text and the woman in the workshop. You, in your particular workshop, on your particular morning, are managing with folded linen, because that's what you've always done. What your mother showed you, what the older women in the workshop showed her. The knowledge in the papyrus scroll is knowledge that exists somewhere in this civilization, but whether it's ever made its way to you is uncertain. That uncertainty is the story. The heat in the workshop climbs steadily. By mid-morning, the air is thick with the smell of linen dust. Not an unpleasant smell, actually. There's something almost clean about it, starchy and dry. And the salt smell of a dozen women sweating at their looms. The sound is rhythmic, the shuttle moving, the beater compressing the weft, the soft intake of breath, the shifting of weight, the occasional low conversation. The overseer moves through the space, checking quality, making corrections, moving on. You keep working, your hands keep moving. The arrangement you've put in place this morning is holding for now. In an hour, you'll need to make an adjustment. You know how to plan for this. You've been planning for this every month for 15 years. Around you, the other weavers are in their own rhythms. Some of them are managing the same thing you're managing. Nobody mentions it. The work continues. This is the baseline. This is where we start. Before the silence gets enforced by religion. Before shame gets systematically attached to something that's simply a biological function. Here in 1550 BCE, in a civilization that had female pharaohs, that had female physicians, that had female scribes, the management of menstruation is a practical problem that at least some portion of the medical establishment has thought about enough to write down. That's actually progress, relative to what comes next. Your name for tonight is Nefertari, not the famous one. There are a lot of Nefertaris in ancient Egypt. The name means beautiful companion, and it's common enough that we shouldn't read anything particular into it. You're a weaver. You're good at your job. You have a daughter who is 11 years old, and will need to have a particular conversation with you in about 2 years. A conversation you've been quietly dreading. Not because you don't know what to say, but because you know exactly what to say, and you know she's not going to like it. You know, because you remember your own mother saying the same things to you. The practical instructions, the particular vocabulary of management that gets passed from mother to daughter, because nobody else is going to provide it. The physicians have their scrolls. You have your mother's hands demonstrating patiently how to fold the linen, how to wash it, how to time things, how to plan. This is a kind of knowledge. It counts. The day passes. Your hands keep moving. The linen grows. And we are going to leave you here, Nefertari, in your workshop in Thebes, because we need to move. We need to cover a lot of ground tonight, and there's a lot of ground to cover. But before we leave, one more thing. There is evidence, fragmentary, debated by historians but present, that some Egyptian women used not just folded papyrus, but actually formed it into a more deliberate shape, softened in water or oil, given a structure that stayed in place better than a simple wad of cloth. The exact details are difficult to reconstruct because the medical texts describe the technique in terms designed for physicians, not for the women using the technique, which means the descriptions assume a level of prior knowledge that we simply don't have access to. But the basic concept is there. The internal solution to this problem, the idea that you could address it from the inside rather than managing it on the outside, that idea is in the Ebers Papyrus in 1550 BCE, 4,000 years ago. The human brain came up with this idea 4,000 years ago. It then spent the next 3,500 years mostly forgetting it, suppressing it, or pretending it wasn't necessary. Now you understand why tonight is interesting. The Nile is the smell of this part of the story. Rich, dark mud. The particular mineral smell of water that's travelled the length of a continent. Green, slightly fermented, alive in a way that northern rivers rarely manage. The papyrus plants along the bank move in a hot breeze. A heron stands completely motionless at the water's edge. We're leaving Egypt, moving forward through time, moving north, moving into the Mediterranean world, where a Greek physician is sitting in a room lit by olive oil lamps, surrounded by clay tablets and papyrus scrolls, trying to think systematically about the human body. His name is Hippocrates. You probably know the name. You probably know the oath, or at least a version of the oath, because the actual Hippocratic oath is a bit different from the modern version in ways that would surprise you, but we're not covering that tonight. Tonight what matters is that Hippocrates, writing in approximately 400 BCE, in the space of his voluminous medical writings, addresses the problem of menstrual management. His solution, as recorded in the surviving texts, is this: lint wrapped around a small piece of wood. Lint and wood. Lightweight, available anywhere, cheap. This is, and I want to be precise here because it matters, the first written description of something recognizably similar to the modern tampon, small enough to be used internally, made from fibre, designed to absorb rather than block. The wood is probably functioning as a kind of applicator, or structural support, or both. Hippocrates was describing this in 400 BCE. You're now in the ancient Greek world, and you're not Nefertari anymore. You're someone else. You are a woman in classical Athens, which means you exist in a civilization that is simultaneously building the philosophical and artistic foundations of Western thought, and keeping its female citizens under a degree of domestic restriction that would feel, to a modern person, somewhere between uncomfortable and claustrophobic. Women of citizen class in classical Athens did not move freely through public space. The ideal was that respectable woman spent her time in the domestic quarters of the house, the gynekonitis, the women's room, typically at the back of the house or on the upper floor, away from the public-facing spaces where men received visitors and conducted business. You went out for specific occasions, religious festivals, funerals, certain market activities, but the city, the agora, The public life of Athens that we associate with this era, the philosophical debates and the political discussions and the theatrical performances, most of that was not your world in any direct participatory sense. This matters for tonight's subject for one specific reason. When you cannot move freely through public space, when your legitimate activities are confined to a particular physical zone, the management of any bodily function becomes a logistical problem inside those constraints. You don't have the option of stepping out to deal with something. You are where you are, and where you are is defined by the walls of your house. Your name tonight in Athens is Lysistrate, not the one from the comedy. Aristophanes wrote that play roughly contemporary to when you're living, and the name, like Nefertari, is common enough. You're the wife of a ceramics merchant. You have 3 children, 2 living. You live in a decent house in the Kerameikos district, which is the potter's quarter of Athens, named for the craft your husband's family has practiced for 3 generations. The house smells of clay dust and smoke, and the particular cooking smells of your kitchen. Olive oil and garlic and something braising over a low fire. Your oldest daughter, who is 14, is probably going to be betrothed within the year. You've had that conversation already. Today, you have a problem. The problem is that there is a religious ceremony this afternoon at the sanctuary of Artemis in the neighbourhood, and you are expected to attend, and it's the second day, and moving through public space with the linen arrangement you've been using since this morning feels, on this particular day, like a managed risk rather than a solved problem. You've been through this calculation before. Many times, the ceremony matters. Absence would be noticed. Social obligations do not pause for biology. What you're using this morning is wool. Clean, fine wool that your mother gave you. She kept a supply of it specifically for this purpose, called it simply the wool for those days, never by any more explicit name even within the household. The wool is soft, it's been washed many times, held in place the same way the Egyptian linen was held in place, by your undergarment, by the careful arrangement of your clothing. Here is what Hippocrates knew that you may or may not know, depending on how information moved in your household. The internal version is more secure, more reliable during movement, less likely to be disrupted by walking or climbing stairs or kneeling at a religious ceremony. The medical knowledge exists. Somewhere in the schools of Cosendidus, the physician training centres that Hippocrates helped to establish, there is a description of an internal solution. But that knowledge is in physician spaces, male spaces, spaces that train men to treat patients rather than to teach patients to treat themselves. Whether it crosses the threshold into the women's quarters of ordinary Athenian households is, again, one of those gaps we can't fully bridge from this distance. You know what you know. You know what your mother showed you. You know what the older women in your neighbourhood have mentioned obliquely, in the particular vocabulary of things that are discussed by implication rather than direct statement. The ceremony this afternoon goes fine. You kneel when kneeling is required. You stand when standing is required. You carry the basket at the appropriate moment. You say the responses in the appropriate places. Nothing goes wrong. Afterward, walking back through the streets of the Kerameikos with 2 other women from the neighbourhood, you pass a physician's house. You don't go in. That's not something you do without an urgent reason. Your husband would need to arrange it. Women seeking medical treatment generally needed a male intermediary to make the appointment, to explain the situation, to interface with the physician. And when I say this created a particular problem for women's medical care, I need you to understand what that means in practice. It means that a significant category of medical knowledge, knowledge directly relevant to female bodies, was systematically filtered through people who didn't have those bodies and who were often uncomfortable discussing the relevant topics. Hippocrates wrote down what he knew, but whether what he knew got to you on this afternoon in the Kerameikos is a function of a social system that wasn't designed with your information needs in mind. The women you're walking with are talking about the ceremony, about which families were there, about someone's daughter and her upcoming marriage. Normal conversation. The kind of conversation that always sounds inconsequential until you realise it's the actual medium through which most practical knowledge about everyday life was transmitted in this era. Not the medical texts, not the philosophical dialogues, the walking conversations, the women in the kitchen, the mothers and daughters and sisters and neighbours building up over decades a practical body of knowledge about how to manage the things that needed managing. This is also a kind of knowledge. It also counts. We need to move again. Forward through time. West and north, toward the Mediterranean coast, toward the city that is in the process of becoming the centre of the known world. We're going to Rome. We're going to the height of the Roman Empire, which means somewhere in the 1st or 2nd century CE, which means we're roughly 1,000 years further along from Nefertari and about 400 years from Lysistrate. Rome is different from Athens in ways that matter for tonight. Roman women of citizen class at least, had considerably more mobility than their Athenian counterparts. They appeared in public spaces, they attended theatrical performances and gladiatorial contests, they went to the baths, they ran businesses in some cases through male agents. They could own property, manage inheritances, appear in court. The Roman world is not an equal world, don't misunderstand me, but the degree of physical restriction that characterized the Athenian ideal was not, generally speaking, the Roman reality, which means the Roman baths. The Roman baths matter for tonight because they are, in their way, the most logistically challenging environment yet for managing menstruation. A bath is a public space. You remove your clothing. You move through warm rooms and hot rooms and cold pools. You are, for an hour or two, in a completely different relationship to your own clothing and your own body than you are at home. You are now, in Rome, a woman named Flavia. You live in the Aventine district, which is one of the old hills of Rome and by this period is a mixed residential neighbourhood. Some patrician families who've been there since the Republic, some freedmen who've done well, some ordinary tradespeople. Your husband is a baker, and not a wealthy baker, but a decent one, with a shop that opens onto the street and does steady business because Romans don't generally have full kitchens in their apartments, and they buy most of their bread commercially. The bakery smells of flour and hot stone and the slightly sour smell of the fermented starter your husband uses, which is kept alive like a small pet in a covered pot near the oven. Today is the public bath day. You go to the baths 3 times a week, which is probably more frequently than most people reading this text go to their baths, but which in Rome is entirely ordinary behaviour. The baths are social spaces as much as cleaning spaces. People meet there. Gossip travels there. It is, in its way, one of the great equalising institutions of Roman life. The senator and the tradesman's wife both needing to get clean, both doing it in the same basic facility, though the senator's wife might go at a different hour or to a different bath complex if she wants to be particular about company. Today, however, you're not sure you want to go. The Roman medical texts, and there are more of them than you might think, writers like Galen and Serranus and Dioscorides, all working in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, and all leaving records that survived, these texts describe, among many other things, wool as a menstrual management material. Soft, clean, possibly treated with oil or other materials to make it more comfortable. Soranus, writing around 100 CE in his work on gynecology, one of the most important gynecological texts from the ancient world, describes various internal preparations. The Roman medical tradition builds on the Greek tradition, which builds on the Egyptian. These physicians know things, they have texts, they have students, the knowledge exists. And it's also true that in Roman culture, the conversation about menstruation was a significantly more complicated one than in Egypt, because Roman men had opinions about menstruation that were, I'm trying to think of a diplomatic way to say this, wrong, spectacularly, creatively, enthusiastically wrong, and also influential. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, written approximately 77 CE, dedicates a genuinely remarkable amount of attention to menstrual blood. He believed, and he's summarizing widely held Roman belief here, not just personal opinion, that menstrual blood could tarnish mirrors, blunt iron tools, kill bees, prevent wine from fermenting, cause fruit to fall from trees, make wine go sour, drive dogs mad, and cause loaded arrows to lose their effectiveness. He also believed it could be used as a magical substance to cure fevers and protect crops, which shows at least some sense of its power, even if his interpretation was completely backwards. None of this is true, obviously. But Pliny was a serious intellectual, not a fringe figure. He was one of the most widely read Roman authors, and if this is what serious Roman intellectuals believed about menstruation, you can imagine what the general cultural attitude was. What it meant in practice was a kind of double invisibility. The subject was both important, because of all those supposed powers, and dangerous to discuss openly, because acknowledging it directly connected you to something that powerful people believed was polluting and unpredictable. You are Flavia, standing in your apartment on the Aventine, and you're deciding whether to go to the baths today. The calculus is not entirely different from Lysistrate's calculus in Athens. Will everything hold? Can you manage the movement? Do you have what you need to prepare? The Roman solution for women who wanted to use the baths on difficult days was almost certainly similar to what the medical texts describe: wool, formed carefully, held in place. Whether Flavia knows the technique described in Soranus, or whether she's arrived at something similar through her own experimentation or her mother's instruction, we can't know. But the practical problem and the practical solution exist in the same place. She goes to the baths. Of course she does. Because not going draws attention of a different kind. Because the rhythm of your week has the baths in it. Because human beings are remarkably good at adapting to circumstances and working with what they have. The bath complex near the Aventine is a medium-sized facility, not one of the grand imperial complexes like the baths of Caracalla or the baths of Diocletian that you might have seen pictures of. Those are later and larger. This is a neighbourhood bath, functional and well-maintained, smelling of stone and warm water and the cedar oil some of the attendants use. The changing room has wooden shelves for clothes. Slaves wait nearby. Not everyone brings a slave, but enough people do that there are always some around. The warm room, the tepidarium, smells of sweat and perfume and the mineral smell of the water that's been running through pipes under the floor, heating the stones. It's crowded in the middle of the afternoon. Women move through the rooms in groups talking. You know the women you're with. You've been coming to these baths for years. The conversation covers the same territory as Lysistrate's walking conversation in Athens. The neighbourhood, the children, someone's husband's business troubles, a wedding coming up. Normal life. and underneath it all the practical fact of bodies managing bodies. Every woman in this room with her own particular system, her own particular solutions. None of it ever mentioned, because the Romans have their own version of that silence, a silence built on Pliny's magical thinking, and the general social decree that this particular subject was better handled privately. You wash, you talk, you dress, you walk home to the bakery. The bread smells good today. Your husband is in the back with flour on his arms. Your children are arguing about something in the courtyard. Normal life, continuing. We're moving again. This time the jump is longer, much longer. We're clearing the fall of the Roman Empire, the chaos of the migration period, the slow consolidation of feudal Europe, and we're arriving in what people call the Middle Ages, let's say the 12th century, which puts us somewhere in the middle of the medieval period, at a moment when Europe is simultaneously building its great cathedrals and conducting its crusades and producing its scholastic philosophers, and also, it should be said, living in physical conditions that would make both Nefertari and Flavia feel their own situations were relatively comfortable. The medieval period is where the silence gets formalized. In Egypt there was practical silence around menstruation, but there were also medical texts discussing it as a bodily function. In Greece and Rome there were physicians who addressed it as a medical matter. There was wrong thinking and magical thinking and social awkwardness, but the basic biological reality was at least occasionally discussed in professional contexts. In medieval Christian Europe, something additional happens. The church gets involved, not in a neutral way. The church's relationship with women's bodies was, I'm going to say complicated because that's the polite word. The relevant text from early church fathers describe menstrual blood in terms that echo Pliny's natural history but add theological weight to the pollution concept. The idea that menstruating women were somehow ritually unclean, drawing on Old Testament text about ritual purity, becomes embedded in religious practice in ways that affect everything from whether women could enter churches during their periods to whether priests should administer communion to menstruating women. There were actual theological debates about this, actual letters between actual bishops arguing about this question with the same seriousness they applied to questions about the nature of the Trinity. The answer in most cases was restrictive. Menstruation became, in the medieval European framework, not just a practical inconvenience, but a mark of female impurity. Something to be hidden, not just socially, but almost spiritually. Something that contaminated. This did not improve the information environment. You are now in England, the 12th century, a village in the countryside north of London, which is still a relatively small city at this point, 100,000 people maybe, compared to the million-plus of Rome at its height. The village has maybe 300 residents. You work the fields in season and keep animals year-round, and your house is a long house, which means you share space with your animals at the cold end of the building, because their body heat contributes to keeping the whole structure warm through the winter. Your name is Agnes. You're a villager, which means you're neither at the very bottom of the medieval social hierarchy, nor anywhere near the top. Your husband holds a few strips of land from the local lord. You have chickens, you have 2 pigs, you have a small kitchen garden, you have 4 children, 2 of whom are old enough to be useful in the fields, and 2 of whom are small enough that they spend significant time being carried or left with older relatives while you work. The smell of your life is very specific. Mud. Always mud. You are in England, which is a country that seems to produce mud as its primary agricultural output. The particular smell of animals in close quarters, which is not a bad smell exactly, it's just very present. very biological, earthy and warm and grassy, and other things that are less poetic than earthy and warm and grassy. Wood smoke, the yeasty smell of bread baking on a griddle over the fire, the smell of your own body, because bathing in the modern sense is not part of your life. You wash your face and hands, and, when the situation requires it, other parts of yourself, but full body bathing is a periodic event rather than a daily one. The management of menstruation in this context comes down to rags. Not the folded linen of ancient Egypt, which was at least purpose-made for this. Rags, old cloth, whatever you have, cut from worn-out garments, saved and washed and reused, held in place by your clothing, by a kind of improvised belt or cord arrangement, because medieval women's undergarments don't have the structural sophistication to hold anything reliably on their own, and what works is essentially a combination of arrangement and constant awareness. This is not comfortable. This is not reliable. This is management in the most literal sense. Constant management, constant adjustment, constant awareness of where you are and what you're doing and how the current situation compares to the requirements of the current activity. You know this from experience. Your mother showed you. She learned from her mother. The information has passed through female hands across generations, unwritten, unrecorded, just transmitted, the way a great deal of practical knowledge in this era was transmitted, by demonstration, by instruction, by watching and being shown. What nobody has told you, because nobody in your world has access to the medical texts that described it, what no one has told you is the internal option. That knowledge, the papyrus, the lint on wood, the wool suppository, that knowledge exists somewhere, in some monastic library, in some copy of a Greek text that a monk has spent years translating, but it is not in your village. It is not in your mother's vocabulary. It is not part of the information environment you actually live in, so you work with what you have. This particular morning in November, and November in 12th century England, is a specific kind of cold, a damp cold that gets into your bones through the walls of your house because the walls are not well insulated by any definition. This morning there is work that can't wait. The pigs need to be fed. The chickens need to be checked for eggs. The older children need to be gotten up and started on their morning tasks before you can address anything else. You move through your morning quickly, because the cold demands movement. Your feet on the earthen floor are cold even through the thick wool stockings you wear year-round. Your breath makes a cloud in the air inside the house. The animals at the other end are stirring, you can hear them, and their smell is particularly present in the morning, concentrated by the night's closed space. The rags you prepared last night are in place. They will not last the morning without attention. You know this. It's not a mystery or a surprise. It's just a calculation you make every month, the same calculation factored into the management of your day. The church says you are impure. The priest in your village would rather not discuss this topic directly, and when it has come up obliquely in the context of religious duties, the advice has been to maintain cleanliness and modesty, and to avoid entering the church during these days if at all possible. The church in your village is the centre of community life. Missing services is noticed. You navigate this with the same pragmatism you apply to everything else. You go when you can. You stay home when the situation makes going inadvisable. You confess when you feel you need to. None of the theology helps with the practical problem. The theology adds shame without adding solutions. This is the medieval contribution to the story. Not new solutions, but new layers of silence. The practical knowledge that existed in the ancient world becomes harder to access. the social permission to even discuss the topic directly becomes narrower. The information gap between what medical texts contain and what ordinary women know gets wider, not narrower, because the medical text tradition is disrupted by the collapse of the Roman educational system and the subsequent centuries of fragmentary preservation in monasteries where, again, the people doing the preserving are mostly men with no personal experience of the problem being described. The net result is that Agnes, in her English village in the 12th century, is working with solutions that are in some ways less sophisticated than what Nefertari had available in 1550 BCE. Not because humanity has gotten stupider, but because specific, practical, female-relevant knowledge has fallen through the gaps of a record-keeping system that was not designed to preserve it. Your pigs are fed, your chickens are checked. 2 eggs today. Your husband is awake and eating bread by the fire. The children are arguing. The day is starting, and this is how it goes. Month after month, year after year, season to season. The cold mud of November, the green mud of March, the dry dust of August. The same monthly management, the same rags, the same calculation, the same silence. Agnes doesn't know that 4,000 years before her, in a city that her world has mostly forgotten existed, a woman named Nefertari solved this problem differently. She doesn't know about the Ebers papyrus. She doesn't know about Hippocrates and his lint and wood. She doesn't know about Soranus and the Roman medical tradition. She knows what her mother showed her. She'll show her daughters the same thing. And for now, that has to be enough. We're moving forward again. This time we're going to cover ground faster. Because the medieval period stretches and stretches. 500 years, 600 years. The basic situation doesn't change fundamentally. It's rags, it's silence, it's management. The specific conditions change. Some eras slightly better, some slightly worse. The theology occasionally more sympathetic, occasionally more severe. The practical materials slightly different depending on what cloth is available and what's affordable. But the fundamental situation is static in a way that's almost hard to absorb. Think about that for a moment. 500 years of essentially no progress on this particular problem. 500 years of rags and improvisation and silence when the problem had a partial solution that was described in a medical text that has existed since 1550 BCE and is sitting in a monastery library somewhere, copied out in careful Latin by a monk who has no idea what the text is actually describing because the relevant vocabulary was uncertain even to scholars until the 20th century. The solution exists. The knowledge exists. The gap between them is a gap of gender and power and information access and social permission, and it doesn't close quickly. But things do start to change, and they start to change because of something that changes everything in the story of human knowledge: industrialization. The Industrial Revolution begins in England, 18th century. Cotton mills and wool mills and iron foundries and steam engines, and a wholesale reorganization of how human beings work, and where they work, and what their daily existence feels like. And within that reorganization, a particular development that is directly relevant to tonight's story. Women go to work in factories. This sounds simple. It is not simple. It is, in the context of the history we've been covering tonight, a genuinely seismic shift. Because when women are working in domestic spaces, in the home, in the field adjacent to the home, in a neighbourhood that functions as an extension of the home, the management of menstruation can be arranged around the domestic environment. You're near your own space. You can make adjustments with reasonable privacy. The rhythm of domestic work has some flexibility. When women work in a factory, those conditions no longer apply. You are now in Manchester. The year is 1835. You're 22 years old, and you've been working in a cotton mill since you were 9, which means you were one of the children who got pulled into the mill system early, before the Factory Acts of the 1830s started putting restrictions on child labour. And even after those restrictions started, enforcement was weak enough and poverty compelling enough that the practical situation for many children didn't change as fast as the law did. You've grown up in the mill system. You know nothing else. Your name is Mary Cooper. You live in a boarding house 2 streets from the mill, a building that holds 14 other mill workers in a space designed for maybe 6. The landlady packing in as many paying boarders as she can manage because the rent money is what keeps her alive, and she's not the only one making that calculation. The room you share with 3 other women smells of their bodies and your body, and the damp wool of drying clothes hung wherever there's a horizontal surface. And in Manchester in 1835 everything is slightly damp because Manchester is both very northern and surrounded by exactly the kind of climate that makes cotton spinning machinery work well, which is to say humid, cool, overcast. The weather feels like the weather has given up. The mill itself is a different kind of sensory experience. And when I say the mill is loud, I need you to understand what that means in a world with no hearing protection standards and no health and safety regulations worth the name, and a machine technology that runs on mechanical power and makes noise accordingly. The looms, power looms by 1835 driven by steam, make a sound that you can feel in your chest as much as hear. A constant rhythmic crashing and banging and clattering that fills the entire building, that makes normal conversation impossible. That means you and the other women communicate in a kind of abbreviated sign language and lip reading that you've developed over years of working in this noise. You've probably suffered some hearing loss already, though you wouldn't have that word for it. Things sound slightly muffled at the end of the day. You've gotten used to that. The air in the mill is full of cotton fibres, fine, light, floating everywhere, settling on every surface, getting into your eyes and your throat and your lungs. You cough. Everyone coughs. There's a particular cough that mill workers develop, a kind of dry, persistent hack that never quite goes away. That's the cotton dust in your lungs doing its slow work. You don't know this yet. In 1835, the disease called byssinosis, brown lung disease, won't be properly described medically for another generation. You just know that you cough, and the older workers cough more, and some of them cough badly enough that they can't work anymore. And when that happens, they just sort of disappear from the mill floor, and you don't ask where they go because there's nowhere good to go. The work is standing work, on your feet for 12 hours, 6 days a week. The mill floor is wooden, worn smooth by decades of workers' feet, but it's still a hard surface, and by the end of the day your feet and your calves and your lower back are conducting a separate argument with the rest of your body about whether this has been worth it. You don't sit down. There are no stools on the mill floor. You stand, you move between machines, you tend the yarn, you repair brakes, you perform your specific job in the continuous mechanical process that takes raw cotton from one end of the building and produces cloth at the other. And in the middle of all of this, once a month, your body does what it does. The management of menstruation in an 1835 cotton mill is, there isn't a diplomatic way to say this, a test of human determination. Your solution is roughly what Agnes had in the 12th century, which is roughly what your mother had, which is what her mother had. Rags. clean rags, or relatively clean rags, secured to a kind of belt arrangement, worn under your work clothes. The work clothes are not elaborate. A rough cotton dress, worn and washed repeatedly until the fabric is thin, an apron over that which takes the worst of the grime, wool stockings, wooden-soled clogs that are better than leather shoes for standing on hard floors all day. The arrangement holds, more or less. More or less is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The mill does not have adequate toilet facilities. In 1835, there is no law requiring factory owners to provide toilet facilities for workers. What there is, in most mills, is an outdoor privy behind the building, accessible during the 2 breaks that punctuate the 12-hour shift. 1 break in mid-morning and 1 around midday. That's it. That is the entirety of the authorised bathroom access in your working day. This means that the adjustment and management that Agnes could do at any point in her domestic morning, because she was working in a space she controlled, you cannot do. You have 2 windows in the day when you can address anything. The rest of the time, you work. Women in cotton mills developed over decades strategies for managing this that involved significant forethought. You know when your cycle is coming. You know the first day and the second day and what the heaviest days feel like. You plan. You prepare the most substantial arrangement possible on those days. You eat less and drink less to reduce the number of times your body needs attention. You stand in particular ways. You position yourself in particular parts of the mill floor. And you don't mention any of this. Not because there's shame in the way the medieval church meant shame, but because this is a mill. The overseer on the floor is a man. The mill owner is a man. The foremen are men. The world of official authority in this space is entirely male, and there is absolutely no language available in that official world for the problem you're managing. And attempting to introduce it would be... you can't even imagine it. It would be mortifying and also useless. There would be nothing done about it, even if you could find the words and the courage to say them. So you don't. You manage. You get on with it. The women you work with know, because they're managing the same thing. But even between women the vocabulary is oblique. There's a language of implication, of raised eyebrows and small nods, of "I'm having a difficult week," and "could you cover for a moment?" A whole system of mutual support conducted in whispers during the brief moments when the machine noise allows whispers. You help each other because you need to help each other, because the institution you're in has made no provision for your actual bodily needs. Mary Cooper finishes her shift at 7 in the evening. 12 hours. She walks home in Manchester drizzle, feet aching, back aching, cotton dust in her lungs and on her dress and in her hair. The boarding house landlady has left a pot of something on the fire, potato soup, thin but hot. Mary eats it standing up in the kitchen because the seats are taken and she's too tired to argue about seats. Then she goes upstairs, tends to herself quickly in the dark because the candle is expensive and she's trying not to use it, and lies down on her share of the mattress she splits with another mill worker who does the morning shift and is already asleep. Mary Cooper is exhausted. Mary Cooper is also, in this particular week, managing a bodily process that her world has no good solution for, with equipment that hasn't fundamentally changed since the 12th century, in conditions that make management actively harder rather than easier, in complete institutional silence. And what's interesting, what matters for the story we're telling tonight, is that right now, in 1835, the world around Mary Cooper is changing faster than it has ever changed before. Steam power, railways being built, factories transforming the economy, more goods being manufactured for more people at lower cost. The basic premises of material life are shifting underneath everyone's feet, but not yet this. Not yet for this. The first commercial menstrual pad won't appear on the market for another 50 years. The first commercially sold internal solution won't appear for nearly 100. Mary Cooper will live and work and die without the situation improving in any material way. Her daughter might see something better. Might. That word is doing a lot of work. Let's talk about what happens next, because what happens next involves two things that seem completely unrelated, but turn out to be connected in a way that's actually quite elegant once you see it. The first thing is the American Civil War. The second is a French invention involving wood pulp. The American Civil War runs from 1861 to 1865. It kills approximately 620,000 soldiers, which is more Americans than any war before or since, and it's not close. It also produces, incidentally, a massive acceleration in the development of medical supply technology, because you have enormous numbers of wounded men who need wound dressings, and you need to produce these dressings quickly, cheaply, and in the field, where the infrastructure of peacetime hospitals doesn't exist. Nurses during the Civil War, and there were thousands of them, many of them women, working in genuinely horrific conditions, made a discovery about the wood pulp-based dressings that were beginning to supplement traditional linen bandages. Wood pulp material, which was new, which had been developed in France and was beginning to be manufactured in America, was significantly more absorbent than linen. Significantly. It could absorb many times its own weight in fluid. It was disposable. You didn't need to wash and reuse it. And it was cheap because wood pulp was cheap. For wound dressings, this was revolutionary. A dressing that absorbed better meant less frequent changing, which meant less pain for the patient and less labour for the nurse, and a lower risk of introducing contamination during dressing changes. The wood pulp dressing was, in the context of Civil War, battlefield medicine, a genuine improvement. The nurses who worked with these dressings were mostly women. Some of them were dealing with their own menstrual cycles while managing enormous nursing workloads in field hospitals. Some of them made a connection that the men around them were unlikely to have made. Here was a material that absorbed fluid far better than anything currently available for the monthly problem. The use of disposable wood pulp material for menstrual management begins, as far as we can reconstruct, among nursing populations in the 1860s. It spreads quietly through female networks, through the same kind of informal information transmission we've been tracking since Nefertari. Nobody writes a newspaper article about it. Nobody patents the idea at this point. It moves through word of mouth, through women telling women, and it constitutes the first real material improvement in the management of menstruation since ancient Egypt. You have to understand how significant disposable is. Mary Cooper washed and reused her rags. Every woman for the preceding centuries washed and reused her rags. The rags existed, they were cleaned, they were kept, they were used again. The ongoing management of reusable rags was itself a labour, not an enormous labour but a persistent one, requiring privacy and water and time, and constituting one more ongoing task in women's lives that was invisible in the historical record because it was so routine, so assumed, so much just part of what women did that nobody thought to mention it. Disposable is different. Use it once, get rid of it. That changes the equation in ways that matter, practically, even if the basic category of solution, external, something worn rather than something internal, hasn't changed. The wood pulp bandage manufacturers begin to notice, in the years after the Civil War, that their products are being purchased in ways that don't correspond to wound care. They're not entirely sure what to do with this information. Some of them begin to see a market. a very large, very consistent market. Half the population once a month for 30 years. That's an extraordinary amount of commercial potential. But how do you sell it? This is the question that occupies the next several decades of this story. Because the commercial opportunity is obvious once you see it, the social obstacle to capturing that commercial opportunity is also obvious. To sell a product for menstrual management, you have to be able to tell people what the product is for. And in Victorian and Edwardian culture, saying that in public is basically impossible. The year is now 1896. You're no longer in Manchester, you're in New York City. And the company that will eventually become Johnson & Johnson, at this point called Lister's Towels, then sold under the name Lister's, then eventually under the brand name that you don't need me to tell you. This company is trying to figure out how to market a product that could help Mary Cooper's granddaughter, who is now working in a New York garment factory and dealing with the same basic problem her grandmother dealt with in Manchester, minus the cotton dust, plus the specific conditions of Lower East Side tenement life. The marketing problem is this. You can't use the word menstruation in an advertisement. You can't describe what the product is for in any direct language. The newspapers won't accept such ads. The magazines won't run them. The social code is explicit. This subject is not to be mentioned in public discourse. So what do? You use code. You develop a language that women will understand and men will overlook. Feminine hygiene. For the needs of women. Worn internally during certain days. Illustrations of women in active poses, playing tennis, swimming, cycling, activities that would be impossible or severely constrained without reliable protection, with the implication that this product enables those activities. This is genuinely clever marketing, and also genuinely revealing of the social situation. The advertising has to simultaneously convey exactly what the product is, and never say what the product is. It has to speak to women while maintaining plausible deniability in public discourse. It has to acknowledge a biological reality, while the social framework is insisting that the biological reality doesn't exist publicly. The product itself, in 1896, is still external, still a pad, not a tampon. The wood pulp-based disposable pad, worn like the rags of previous centuries but designed for the purpose, disposable, standardized. This is an improvement. This is a real improvement, though the method of securing it, usually pins, often a special belt that you have to purchase separately, sometimes both, has its own challenges and its own rate of failure that any woman who has ever dealt with a pin working loose at an inconvenient moment can imagine without further description. But the internal option, the thing Hippocrates described, the thing the Ebers papyrus described, that comes later, slightly later, and it comes from a direction that surprises people. Let me tell you about Earle Haas, because Earle Haas is one of the genuinely odd figures in this history, and his story is worth telling properly. Earle Haas was a physician from Boulder, Colorado. He was born in 1888. He was not a gynecologist. He was not a specialist in women's health. He was a general practitioner, the kind of doctor who treated everything in a general practice, which in the early 20th century meant you saw a very wide range of patients, and dealt with a very wide range of problems, and developed opinions about a lot of different things based on clinical observation. In 1929, Earle Haas applied for a patent. The patent described a device consisting of an absorbent cylinder that could be inserted internally, held in place by the body, and attached to a cord for removal. The absorbent cylinder was designed to compress into a smaller tube for insertion, housed within 2 cardboard tubes. an outer tube and an inner tube that would push the device into position. The modern tampon applicator, that's what Earle Haas invented. Or more precisely, that's what Earle Haas patented. There may have been similar devices before, created by individual women solving their own problem, that never entered the historical record because they never entered the commercial patent system. The history of women's practical inventions is full of this phenomenon, solutions that existed in private practice for decades before they appear in official records, because women's solutions to women's problems existed in that same informal information network we've been following all night. But Earle Haas has a patent. 1929, the year of the great stock market crash, which is interesting timing but irrelevant to the invention itself. Now here's where the story gets more interesting. Earle Haas tries to sell his patent to a commercial company. He approaches several turn him down. The sales pitch for a menstrual tampon in 1929 faces the same marketing challenge that the 1896 pad faced. Plus, an additional problem. People are afraid of internal solutions. Physicians worry about it. The medical establishment worries about it. There is in the general cultural conversation a significant anxiety about the idea of women using something internally. A confusion of clinical gynecological concepts with cultural assumptions about female bodies that I can describe accurately or diplomatically, but not both. The patent as a result languishes, until a woman buys it. Her name is Gertrude Tendrich. She's a businesswoman living in Denver. We don't know as much about her as we should, which is itself telling. She buys Haas's patent in 1933, reportedly for the price of $1 and a royalty arrangement. The accounts vary on the exact terms, but the key fact is that it was Gertrude Tendrich who saw the commercial potential clearly enough to act on it, who founded the company that became Tampax, who took the patent from the drawer it was sitting in and turned it into a product and a company, and eventually a publicly traded corporation. She was manufacturing and selling tampons from her home, starting with sewing machines in her apartment, making the first commercial tampons by hand and in small batches, building up from there. The scale is almost comically small in the beginning. Dozens of units, then hundreds. She's making these things herself, in her apartment, in Denver, Colorado, in the middle of the Great Depression. This is not a small act of courage. In 1933, in the cultural context we've been describing, starting a company to manufacture and sell internal menstrual products required a willingness to do something publicly that the entire social framework was saying should not be done publicly. Tendrich did it anyway. The company she founded, Tampax Sales Corporation, eventually just Tampax, grows slowly at first and then quickly. The challenge of marketing doesn't go away, but Tendrich is good at working within the constraints, the same way the Lister's towels people had been good at it in 1896. Language that women understand without using words that can't be said. Illustrations of active women, free, mobile, unencumbered. The suggestion of a different relationship to one's own body and one's own life, without saying directly what was being offered. And there's something else that's new, that hadn't been part of the marketing of pads. The freedom narrative. The tampon can be hidden. Nobody knows you're wearing it. You can swim in it. You can run in it. You can go about your day without the bulk and the arrangement and the pins and the belt. This is presented, carefully, obliquely, but unmistakably, as a kind of liberation. A physical freedom from a constraint that had been present for the entirety of human history. That's not overselling it. The functional difference between a tampon and a belt and pin arrangement is significant. The practical freedom it enables is real. Women who've spent their lives managing the external solution and who switch to the internal one generally don't go back. The historical testimony on this, when you can find it, is consistent. But the path to mainstream adoption is not smooth. Because the medical establishment has concerns. And when I say the medical establishment has concerns, I mean that in 1945, a pamphlet is circulated by a group of physicians suggesting that internal menstrual protection might interfere with female physiology in various ways. The concerns range from the medically real, some legitimate questions about material safety and infection risk, to the medically bizarre, suggestions that internal use might be somehow inappropriate for unmarried women, which was not a medical concept and was not pretending to be a medical concept, and was instead the long shadow of that cultural anxiety about female bodies cast into medical language. The American Medical Association eventually weighs in, and their conclusion is that, properly used, the tampon is safe. This matters. This shifts the conversation. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, tampon use is growing steadily, driven partly by the changing conditions of women's work and life. World War II, like the Civil War before it, accelerates things. When millions of American women go to work in factories and offices and military support roles while the men are overseas, the practical premium on reliable concealed menstrual management increases. The tampon fits that context better than the alternatives. Sales grow. Competitors enter the market. The conversation around women's health, while still coded and oblique, begins to have slightly more space in it for this particular subject. You're now in 1942, and you are Kathleen. You're 24 years old, and you work at the Boeing plant in Seattle, building B-17 bombers. You're Rosie the Riveter, not literally, not the poster, not the figure that becomes iconic, but you are exactly what Rosie represents. You were a housewife 18 months ago. You had a husband who worked at the post office, and a small apartment in the Rainier Valley, and a life that was defined by domestic routines and neighborhood rhythms. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and your husband enlisted, and Boeing put out a call for workers, and you went. The Boeing plant is enormous, bigger than anything you'd ever been inside before. Hundreds of thousands of square feet under one roof, the sounds of machinery and metal and riveting guns combining into a continuous industrial roar that makes the Manchester cotton mill sound quiet by comparison. You work on a specific section of the fuselage. Your job requires physical precision in a confined space. You are, quite literally, inside the aircraft half the time, working in the interior of the bomber frame, reaching into spaces that require particular body positions and a lot of core strength and arms that have gotten significantly stronger in the last 18 months than they were when you started. Boeing has better bathroom facilities than the cotton mill. They have to. The factory was built in the 20th century, not the 19th, and there are federal regulations and union agreements that have required actual facilities. You have bathroom access during shifts, within limits. This is better. But the plant runs on shifts and schedules and production quotas, and taking extra time in the bathroom is noticed and occasionally commented on. And the culture of a wartime production floor is not a culture that makes space for explanation or accommodation. You do what needs doing as quickly as possible, and you get back to work. You tried the tampon for the first time about 6 months ago. A woman on your shift recommended it. She'd been using them since before the war, she said, and she couldn't imagine going back. The conversation happened in the women's locker room between shifts, with the casual directness of women who've been working together long enough to dispense with the elaborate codes of the department store beauty counter. She described it practically. She said it worked. She said it made the job easier. Kathleen went to the drugstore that week and bought a box. She stood in the aisle for longer than was necessary, reading the instructions twice because she was doing this alone, and she wanted to be sure she understood it. And then she brought it home. The learning curve is real. Nobody at Boeing and nobody in the drugstore is going to tell you that there's a learning curve, because acknowledging the learning curve requires acknowledging what the product is and how it works in language that the culture has not yet made available in public. The instructions in the box are helpful but written in the same oblique language as the advertisements. You work it out, and then you go to work the next day, and it's better, genuinely better. The freedom the advertising promised is not hyperbole. The not thinking about it, the being able to go up the ladder and into the fuselage cavity and focus entirely on the rivets and the angle and the specific mechanical problem you're solving. This is different from what came before. Kathleen thinks about this for a moment. At the end of a shift, walking back to the locker room in the particular exhaustion of a woman who's been building aircraft for 8 hours, she thinks, why didn't anyone tell me about this sooner? The answer, which she doesn't fully think through, but which we can think through for her, is the entire history we've been covering tonight. 4,000 years of practical knowledge transmitted through informal female networks, suppressed and coded and never spoken plainly, so that each generation is partly reinventing the wheel and partly relying on the accident of whether they happen to know the right woman at the right time, who is comfortable saying the right thing. Your mother didn't tell you, not because she didn't love you, because she didn't know, because her mother didn't tell her, because the pharmacist couldn't say it out loud, because the doctor was a man who found the topic uncomfortable, because the advertising couldn't use real words. You were 24 years old and you had to learn this from a co-worker in a Boeing locker room. This is still progress, relative to everything before it, but it's a strange kind of progress. Kathleen finishes her shift. She writes a letter to her husband, who is in the Pacific. She doesn't mention any of this in the letter, because there's no language for it in correspondence that will be read by a military censor, and also because the letter is about how she misses him, and what the weather is like in Seattle, and the neighbour's cat who keeps getting into the building. Normal things. The things that make normal life feel continuous when normal life is anything but. She seals the letter. She goes to sleep. Outside, Seattle is dark because of the blackout regulations. The Boeing plant is running 24 hours. The bombers are getting built. The world is in the middle of a war. And inside that world, quietly, without ceremony, a 4,000-year-old problem is getting slowly, incrementally, imperfectly better. We're almost at the end of the story. Almost. We have one more place to go, and it's the most important one for understanding the world you're going to fall asleep in tonight. We're going to 1980. We're going to stay there for a while, because what happens in 1980 is the thing that shapes every box of tampons you've ever seen, every label you've ever read, every warning that you've probably skipped past without reading because it was fine. It was always fine, until it wasn't. You're in Cincinnati. You're 31 years old. Your name is Linda Remmers, and you're a school teacher, 4th grade. And it's a Thursday in September, and you're in the middle of the school year, and everything is normal. Everything is completely normal. You've been using tampons since you were 17. 14 years. You have a favourite brand, as most women who use them do. Habits get established, products get familiar. But about 6 months ago, your usual brand was briefly out of stock at the grocery store and you picked up something new. Something that had been heavily advertised. Something called Rely. Rely was made by Procter & Gamble. It had been in development since the 1960s and came to market in the 1970s, and the reason it was different from other tampons was that it was made of different materials, not the compressed cotton of the original Haas design, something new. A combination of carboxymethyl cellulose, synthetic material, and compressed beads of polyester foam. These materials were extraordinarily absorbent, more absorbent than anything that had existed before. The tagline was that it even absorbed the worry, and the marketing emphasized that you didn't need to change it as often, that it provided extended protection, that you could go longer between changes. This was presented as an improvement. It was, in a very narrow technical sense, an improvement in absorbency. In a broader and more important medical sense, it was a catastrophic mistake. On this particular Thursday in September of 1980, you are not feeling well. You've been not feeling well since yesterday. You chalked it up to something you ate, then to the stress of the school year starting, then to a mild cold. But this morning, when you got up, you felt dizzy. Not just tired dizzy, the kind of dizzy that goes away when you've had coffee. Real dizzy. The room tilting kind. And you have a fever, which you checked with the thermometer before you came to school because you're conscientious about that. You don't want to expose your students to something contagious. And it was 101, which is not nothing but is not alarming enough to make you stay home, especially in the first month of school when absences feel significant. You came to school. You're teaching 4th grade. The children doing a math exercise, pencil scratching, and you're standing at the front of the room and something is wrong. Something is wrong in a way you can't quite identify. You're hot, much hotter than a fever of 101 explains. Your hands feel strange, not numb but not quite right. A tingling at the fingertips that wasn't there this morning. And your stomach has been cramping, not in a way that's connected to anything in your recent eating, just a general cramping abdominal discomfort that's been building through the morning. You get through the morning, you're a school teacher, which means you are constitutionally capable of functioning through significant discomfort, because children require you to function regardless. At lunch, in the teacher's room, you sit down, and a colleague takes one look at you and says, "You should go home." You go home. By the time you get home, your temperature is 103.4. You check it immediately because the drive home scared you. You felt twice like you might lose the road for a moment, a floating sense of unreality that was not like being tired. Your hands, when you take your temperature, are shaking slightly. You call your doctor. He's not available. Thursday afternoon, he has rounds at the hospital. His secretary takes a message and says someone will call back. You lie down. You feel like the world is tilting. You don't know, lying in your Cincinnati bedroom on this Thursday afternoon, that you are one of a cluster of cases that the Centers for Disease Control has been tracking for months. You don't know that they've already published in June of this year a report in their Morbidity and Mortality Weekly report describing an outbreak of a syndrome they're calling toxic shock syndrome, TSS, characterized by fever, rash, low blood pressure, and multi-organ failure, occurring predominantly in young women, predominantly occurring during menstruation, with a statistical association to tampon use that is so strong it cannot be dismissed as coincidence. You don't know any of this because most people don't read the CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, and because the mainstream media is still working out how to cover a story that requires the same vocabulary problem that has plagued every discussion of this topic since 1896. This story requires the words tampon, menstruation, vaginal, and toxic shock to appear in the same sentence in a family newspaper. And some editors are more willing to do this than others, and the ones who aren't willing are creating a gap in public awareness that is, at this moment, actively dangerous. You don't know that Rely tampons in particular have been identified as having an elevated risk, that the superabsorbency that made them feel like an improvement is the feature that makes them dangerous. That highly absorbent material creates conditions inside the body that allow certain bacteria, specifically Staphylococcus aureus, which is a bacteria that lives on human skin and in nasal passages and is normally harmless, to produce a toxin at a dramatically elevated rate. That the toxin then enters the bloodstream and produces systemic effects that can progress from flu-like symptoms to multi-organ failure within hours. You don't know that by the end of 1980, at least 38 women will have died from tampon-associated toxic shock syndrome. That many more will have been seriously ill, that some will have long-term health consequences from the illness. You don't know that the investigation that the CDC is conducting, the association they've established, is going to result in one of the fastest product recalls in American corporate history. That Procter & Gamble will pull Rely from store shelves in September of 1980. This month, this September, while you're lying in your bedroom, while defending the product publicly, entering into a legal settlement that includes the agreement to fund research into TSS in exchange for the ability to frame the recall as voluntary rather than forced. You don't know any of this lying there. What you know is that you feel genuinely, seriously wrong, worse than you've ever felt from a cold or flu, a different category of wrong, the kind that makes you aware that something inside your body is not working correctly. The tingling in your hands has moved up your arms. Your temperature when you check it again at 5 in the afternoon is 104.1. You've also developed in the last hour a rash on your torso, faint reddish, almost like a sunburn. But you haven't been outside today. You call your husband at work. He comes home. He takes one look at you and he calls an ambulance. In the emergency room, the intake nurse asks you questions that include, among the standard questions, what kind of tampon you're using. This happens because Cincinnati's hospital system has already received the CDC alert, has already been briefed on the pattern, and has been instructed to ask this question of any woman presenting with these symptoms. The nurse asks. You tell her. She notes the brand. The doctors who treat you move quickly once they have the picture. IV fluids, antibiotics, monitoring. The bacterial toxin that's in your bloodstream responds to treatment, with treatment, but there's a period of approximately 6 hours in which your blood pressure drops to a level that is medically dangerous, where the doctors are managing a situation that could go several different ways, and one of the ways is not a good way. You're in the hospital for 4 days. When you come home, you are weak, genuinely, physically weak in a way you've never experienced. Not tired, but muscle weak. The weakness that follows serious illness, as if your body used something fundamental to get through that crisis and hasn't restocked it yet. You sleep 12 hours a night. You go back to your class after 2 weeks, and by the end of the first day back you're exhausted in a way that a normal school day doesn't produce. You recover. Fully, as it turns out. You're one of the ones for whom it goes well. Some women are not so fortunate. Some women die. Some women have permanent damage to fingers, to toes, to their hearing, to their kidneys. The toxin is not specific in its damage. It attacks systems, and the aftermath can leave traces. The brand of tampon you are using is pulled from the market on September 22nd, 1980. Procter & Gamble issues a press release describing it as a voluntary recall, pending further research. They run ads in major newspapers advising women to stop using Rely. The FDA issues a warning. For the first time in American history, menstrual products are major national news. The story appears in every major newspaper. It's on the evening news. It's in conversations that people are having at dinner tables, in offices, in the places where public conversation happens. The vocabulary that the social code has suppressed for a century is suddenly in use. Tampon, menstruation, toxic shock syndrome. The silence that has defined this story since ancient Egypt breaks open. Not because people chose to break it, because women's lives depended on the information being communicated. And here's the thing about that breaking open that matters for everything that follows. Because the TSS crisis doesn't just cause the recall of one product, it causes the fundamental rethinking of the regulatory framework around menstrual products. Before 1980, tampons existed in a regulatory grey area. They were medical devices in some respects, but regulated like cosmetics in others, with very limited requirements for pre-market testing or post-market surveillance. After the TSS crisis, the FDA classifies tampons as medical devices subject to medical device regulations. Requirements for testing, requirements for labeling, requirements for the absorbency standardization. That means that when a box of tampons says regular or super plus, those words mean something specific and measurable, not just whatever the manufacturer decided they meant. The warning label that appears on every box of tampons sold in the United States since 1982, the one about toxic shock syndrome, the one about using the lowest absorbency needed, the one about changing frequently. That warning label is a direct consequence of 1980, of the women who got sick, of the women who died, of the CDC investigation that identified the pattern, of the public conversation that finally happened because there was no longer any socially acceptable way to avoid it. The crisis was catastrophic. The regulatory response it produced was necessary and overdue. Both of those things are true simultaneously. Linda Remmers goes back to teaching 4th grade. She switches to a different brand, lower absorbency, changes it more frequently. She reads the warning label, which is new, which wasn't there before. She knows what the words mean now in a way she didn't 6 months ago. She teaches 4th grade for another 22 years. She's good at it. Her students, years later, adults in the 21st century, will buy tampons at the drugstore without thinking about where they came from, without thinking about the patent that Earle Haas filed in 1929 or the apartment in Denver where Gertrude Tendrich built a company with a sewing machine, or the CDC investigation that produced the warning label they're probably not reading, or the woman named Nefertari in a workshop in Thebes who was solving this problem with papyrus in 1550 BCE. They don't know the history. Of course they don't. Most people don't know the history. But the history is there, under everything, underneath the cellophane wrapper and the clean white packaging and the discreet advertising that still, in 2024, uses blue liquid instead of anything that looks like the actual substance being absorbed, the actual substance that has been part of human life since long before the pyramids, since before writing, since before cities or agriculture or language, certainly underneath all of that is the story we've been following tonight. 4,000 years of women solving a problem with whatever they could find. Papyrus, wool, lint and wood, medieval rags, industrial rags, cotton bandages repurposed from Civil War medicine, commercial pads with safety pins and belts. The first disposable pad sold under language so coded it barely described itself. The tampon that Haas patented and Tendrich commercialized, and that spread through informal female networks before it became a grocery store product. The super absorbent innovation that turned out to be dangerous, the crisis that finally broke the silence. The regulatory framework built on the information that the silence had been suppressing, and now you, tonight, wherever you are, you've probably never thought about any of this before. Most people haven't. That's not a criticism. There are a lot of things in the world that are old and important and invisible. Histories that haven't been told because the people living those histories weren't writing the official records, weren't the ones deciding what counted as worth recording. The history of how ordinary human bodies managed ordinary biological processes is one of those invisible histories. It's not glamorous. It doesn't involve battles or great speeches or famous men making momentous decisions. It involves women in workshops and kitchens and factories and hospitals, solving problems with available materials, passing solutions to each other through the only channels available, doing the work of being human in a world that was simultaneously too embarrassed to help them and too dependent on them to acknowledge the help they weren't getting. That's history too. In fact, in terms of how many people's daily lives it affected, it might be the most universal kind of history there is. The world outside, wherever you are right now, has a certain sound to it. Maybe traffic, maybe wind, maybe the particular quiet of late night, which is not real quiet, but a version of quiet in which the background sounds you normally filter out become briefly audible. Heating systems, a refrigerator. Distant, the sound of a city that doesn't entirely sleep. The women in this story had their own sounds. Nefertari had the Nile. The water sounds, the reed sounds, the particular acoustic of an Egyptian morning before the heat builds. Lysistrate had Athens, which was noisy in its own way, a city built around commerce and civic life with stone acoustics that would have bounced every conversation off every wall. Flavia had the bakery, which had the oven sounds and the smell of bread beginning before dawn, and her husband's voice and her children in the courtyard. Agnes had the English countryside, which has its own silence, the silence of open fields and limited neighbours or animals that mark time in their own rhythms. Mary Cooper had Manchester roaring around her even in the dark, even in the boarding house, the city that never really stopped. Kathleen had the wartime blackout silence of Seattle, the city holding its breath. Linda had Cincinnati, which is an ordinary American city going about its ordinary American business, and which on one particular Thursday afternoon in September stopped being ordinary for 31 years of muscle memory and became something else. All of them are here tonight, in some sense, in the sense that the history of the world is not just the famous people and the famous events, but the continuous ordinary work of ordinary people solving ordinary problems under whatever conditions they found themselves in. They solved this problem, each of them, in the way available to them, in the time they were in, with what they had. You're warm right now. You're comfortable. You have whatever you have. That's more than most of them had for most of history. It's enough. Your breathing is slowing. The thoughts that were moving through your mind a few minutes ago are becoming less insistent. The sounds of where you are becoming background again, the way sounds become background when you stop attending to them and let them just exist. Nefertari in her workshop, hands on the loom, the papyrus at the edge of the Nile, the heat, the smell of mud and water, the sound of the shuttle, Lysistrate walking home through the Kerameikos, the sound of the potter's district, the clay smell of it, the city in the afternoon, Flavia and the bread, the oven, the children arguing, the bakery sounds, Agnes and the English mud and November, the animals at the other end of the long house, the cold floor, getting through the day, Mary Cooper in Manchester. The loom sounds, even now, even at night, even in the boarding house, you should still hear the mills from the street. The body warmth of the women in the room, the thin wool blanket, Kathleen and the bomber plant, the rivet gun sounds going quiet at the end of the shift, Seattle in the rain, Linda and the white ceiling of a Cincinnati hospital room, getting better, going home, and you, tonight, wherever you are, the sounds around you, let them slow, let the history settle back into the distance, back into the past, which is where it lives, which is where we've been, which is where we always are in these stories before we come back to the present. The present is this, the warmth, the dark, the breath. You've been carrying the weight of knowing something tonight that you didn't know at the beginning. The weight of a history that nobody told you, that got lost for most of its length, and found again in pieces, that is still partly lost, still partly not told. That weight is real. But you don't have to carry it right now. You can put it down. Let your hands go loose, your shoulders, the muscles along your spine that have been holding you in whatever position you've been in. Let them go easy. The Nile is still out there somewhere, still flowing north, the same river, changed completely since 1550 BCE and also exactly the same in the ways that matter. Dark, muddy, alive, moving toward the sea. The papyrus grows along its banks in exactly the same way. Things endure, things change. Both are true. You're warm enough, safe enough, rested enough. Tomorrow there will be things to do and places to go and people who need you, but that's tomorrow. Right now there's just the slow drift, the breath going in, the breath going out, the sounds of wherever you are becoming quieter, not because the world is getting quieter, but because you're going somewhere the world's sounds don't follow. Let it take you. The way sleep has been taking people at the end of hard days for as long as there have been hard days, which is as long as there have been people, which is longer than the pyramids and longer than the Ebers papyrus, and longer than the Nile's recorded history, and longer than any story anyone has ever told. This is the oldest part, the rest. Take it, good night. We're not done with Nefertari. We stayed too briefly. We moved through her morning like tourists with the schedule, and the whole point of tonight is that we don't do that. We stay. We feel it. So we go back, and this time we don't leave until we've actually been there. The darkness in the room where Nefertari wakes is the kind of darkness that disorients you for a full 3 seconds when you open your eyes. The ceiling is just a slightly denser version of the dark, the reed matting of the roof just barely distinguishable from the air below it. 4 women sleep in this room. The one closest to you has her back turned, and her breathing is slow and deep, and the warmth of her body is detectable even across the hand's width of space between you. The floor beneath the sleeping mat is packed earth, hardened by years of feet, and the mat itself smells like dried reed and dust, and the faint animal smell of the wool blanket you pull over yourself in the coldest months. It's not the coldest month. The air is warm already at this hour with that particular Egyptian warmth that never fully disappears even in the deepest part of the night, because the stones of the city hold the heat of the day, and release it slowly through the dark hours. You sit up. Not dramatically, not urgently. You've been doing this every morning of your adult life, and you know your own body well enough to move with a specific, practiced care on the second day. Not fear, efficiency. The way a craftsperson handles a tool that requires a particular grip. You know what you're working with, you know its properties, you move accordingly. Your feet find the floor, the packed earth is cool under your soles. The coolness travels up through your feet and calves with the immediacy of direct contact, the way temperature transfers when there's nothing between you and the thing. You stand. The room holds its breath around you. The other women still sleeping, their breathing unchanged. The water jar in the corner. You feel your way to it, not quite feeling your way. Your body knows this room. Your feet know exactly how many steps. And you dip your hands in and bring the water to your face 3 times. The water is from the Nile, carried yesterday from the communal source, and it has the Nile's slight mineral taste and the Nile's slight grit of silt that settles at the bottom of a jar but never quite goes away. On your face it is shockingly precise. The coldness hits your cheekbones and forehead, and the ridge of your nose with a clarity that sleep cannot compete with. You are awake now, fully, undeniably awake. Dressing in the dark is a skill like any other. The linen tunic, white once, and now the colour, that white Egyptian linen becomes after hundreds of washings. Not yellow, not grey, just formally white. A shade that doesn't have a name because it's too ordinary to need one. Over it, the work apron, heavier linen, that will protect the tunic from the fibre dust and the lint that fills the workshop air from the moment the first loom starts working. Your hair bound back with a strip of cloth you tie without looking. Then the preparation you made the night before, the particular arrangement of folded linen that you check now with your hands. Make the necessary adjustments in the dark with the quiet focus of long practice, and then you are ready. The street outside is the smell of Thebes, which is first and always the smell of the Nile. This morning the river is particularly present. There's a slight mist off the water, the kind that forms when the water is cooler than the air in late summer, and the mist carries everything the river carries. Mud, water, the green smell of papyrus in the shallows, the faint smell of fish, the mineral smell of a very large body of water that has travelled 4,000 miles from its source and brought a sample of everything it passed on its way. Under this, as you walk toward the workshop, the city begins to layer its own smells onto the morning. Bread already from the ovens that the bakers start before dawn. The dusty animal smell of cattle being moved somewhere. The dung on the road, which is dry in the summer heat, dry enough to be fairly inoffensive, but which in the flood season becomes something else entirely. Your feet know this walk, your sandals, woven papyrus, the same material as the sleeping mats, the same material as the medical text in the physician's scroll, the same material as the papyrus offered as an alternative solution in that text which may or may not have ever crossed into the world of practical female knowledge, but the sandals, at least, the sandals are unambiguously ordinary, and your feet know the feel of them on this particular road at this particular hour. The workshop opens with the sound of a wooden bolt sliding back. The woman who opens it is the senior weaver, who has been here longer than anyone and who carries the authority of experience in a way that requires no official title. She opens the workshop the way someone opens something they've opened 10,000 times, without ceremony, without drama. The bolt slides, the door swings, the smell of the workshop comes out to meet you, and this is a specific smell. This is the smell you know better than almost any other smell in your life. The smell of linen in various stages of being made. The raw fibre has one smell, dry, dusty, slightly vegetal, the smell of a plant that has been dried and processed and stripped down to its essentials. The finished woven cloth has a different smell, denser, warmer, almost sweet in a very faint way, and in between, the smell of the process, the size that stiffens the warp threads, the particular sweat of a room full of people working steadily in a warm climate, the faint smell of the wooden looms themselves. Old wood worn smooth, carrying decades of absorbed oils and fibre dust. You take your place. The horizontal loom, your loom, the one you've been working for 3 years, that fits your body the way a tool fits a hand it's shaped itself to. The beam in front of you, the heddle arrangement above, the threads of the warp already set from yesterday, running away from you in parallel lines, so fine they seem almost to vibrate with potential. Fine linen, the good stuff. The kind that will be inspected by someone with authority before it ever leaves this workshop, and if it doesn't pass that inspection it will be taken apart and done again. Your hands begin. This is the deepest knowledge you have, not knowledge you can explain easily, not knowledge that lives in language, but knowledge that lives in the muscles of your forearms and the particular sensitivity of your fingertips and the calibrated tension of your shoulders. The shuttle passes through the shed. Your left hand guides it. Your right hand catches. The heddles shift. The beater moves. You compress the new row of weft into the work. A single row of cloth. Done. Do it again. Around you the workshop fills as the other women arrive, one by one, taking their places at their looms. The sounds begin to build. The rhythmic clicking of shuttles, the soft percussion of beaters, the occasional creak of a wooden frame. And underneath all of this, conversation, low and continuous, the conversation of women who have spent thousands of hours in this room together and who talk, because the work allows talking, because the rhythm is established enough that words fit in between the movements without disrupting them. Children and husbands and the neighbour's goat and the price of grain at the market and the smell from the tanning yard 3 streets over and the festival coming up next month at the Temple of Amun. Normal life, happening inside the rhythm of work. Halfway through the morning, the physician comes. You heard yesterday that he was coming. Word moved through the workshop in the way that word about anything interesting always moves. Quickly, in pieces, with commentary attached. A physician, here. For Merat's eyes, the old weaver who has been squinting at her work for months now, who holds the thread close to her face in a way that suggests the world is becoming blurrier at the edges, someone is coming from one of the temple medical schools to look at her. He arrives when the morning is at its worst heat, the sun above the roof's edge, the workshop air thick despite the reed screens that shade the windows. He's younger than you expected, about your age, maybe a few years older, with the shaved head of someone trained at the temple school, and the kind of expression that belongs to someone who has learned a great deal of information in a structured environment and knows it. He carries a wooden case. His assistant, younger still, possibly a student, carries a separate case and a roll of papyrus and a palette for writing. He examines Merat's eyes. You watch from your loom, not stopping your work. It would be noticed if you stopped, but watching from the side of your vision while your hands continue their own work. The shuttle passing, the beater moving, the cloth growing row by row. The physician is methodical. He asks questions. Merat answers in the particular clipped way she always speaks, giving the necessary information without elaboration. He tilts her face toward the light coming through the window screen, looks at her eyes with his own very close, hums something non-committal. He writes something on the papyrus. His case, which sits open on a low table near where Merat works, contains things you can see from where you are. Small clay vessels sealed with wax, rolled papyrus scrolls, the small kind used for specific texts rather than long documents, tools you can't identify, bronze things, small. The organised contents of a trained medical practice fitting into a box the size of a bread basket. What's in those scrolls? This is what you think, watching him write his note. What does he know that nobody in this workshop knows? What is written in those papyrus scrolls that has never made its way from the schools where they're studied to the rooms where women actually live? The Ebers papyrus is being written right now, in this period. In this city, or somewhere nearby, a team of scribes is creating a document that represents the collected medical knowledge of this civilization, and that document will survive 4,000 years and be translated in the 20th century and contain, in its section on women's medicine, a description of something that every woman in this workshop could use. Soft papyrus, moistened, formed. An internal solution to a problem that every woman in this room is managing right now, today, in the way that has been passed from mother to daughter, without ever being given official language. The physician does not tell you this. He is here for Merat's eyes. He's not here to discuss anything else. He gives Merat a papyrus with instructions and a small sealed pot of something, eye drops probably, or a wash, and he bows to the overseer and he leaves. His assistant follows with the cases. The door closes behind them. Merat examines the pot in her hands, turns it over, reads the label with the focus of someone whose reading is laboured. A woman beside her leans over to help with the character she can't make out. The workshop's rhythm resumes. The shuttle, the beater, the sound of 60 women making fine linen, a sound that has continued for decades in this room and will continue for decades more. Your hands don't stop. Your count of rows is in the back of your mind, where it always is. By afternoon, you'll have made a specific length that the overseer will measure when she makes her rounds. Not enough, and there's a conversation you'd rather not have. Enough, and you move into the next section without comment. The afternoon light changes the workshop. The hard overhead light of midday gives way to a more angled light that comes in lower through the window screens and catches the threads of the warp at a different angle, making them briefly visible as individual lines of gold or silver or whatever colour catches on them today. The dust motes float in the beams of light, linen fibre mostly, so fine it looks like smoke, like the air itself made visible. By the time you're walking home, the light has gone orange and the shadows are long, and the Nile is doing the thing it does in late afternoon, where it reflects the sky and becomes indistinguishable from the sky in colour, as if the water and the air decided to agree on something. The city around you is loud in the evening way, the day workers going home, the market vendors packing up, children released from whatever they were doing during the hottest part of the day and now running in the streets with the energy that builds up when you've been still for too long. Your feet are tired. The standing work. The concrete floor of the workshop baked by heat. Your lower back has its usual evening complaint. Tomorrow's the third day. Easier. And the day after that, easier still. And then a period of weeks where this particular management isn't required and your body just does its other things. The things that are invisible in the historical record for different reasons. You eat your evening meal, bread and lentils and something preserved in oil, that has a good sharp flavour. You drink beer, weak and thick and sweet, the daily beer that Egyptians of your class drink instead of water, because the beer is safer than the water from the closer sources. You sit with the women from the workshop, or some of them. The conversation is the same as the morning conversation, just tired, less detailed. The news of the day, who did what the overseer said, whether the new girl in the fine linen section is going to work out. You go to sleep. The Nile smell comes in through the window. 4,000 years from tonight, someone is going to find a papyrus scroll in a storage jar near Luxor, and they're going to translate it, and they're going to find the description of the solution that the physician in his case carried with him today. That was already somewhere in his training, already part of the medical literature of this civilization. And the person doing that translation is going to note it in an academic paper that will be read by other scholars and eventually make its way into popular accounts of ancient medicine. But you don't know that. You know your hands. You know your loom. You know the particular weight of fine linen finished well, the smoothness of it, the slight coolness it holds even in the Egyptian summer. You know what you know. Sleep comes fast when you work with your body all day. It comes the way it always comes, without ceremony, without announcement. One moment you're in the room, and the next moment you are somewhere else entirely. Good night, Nefertari. Now, Agnes. We said we were in the 12th century, and we moved through her mourning quickly, and that was not fair to her. Agnes deserves more than a paragraph. Agnes's life deserves to be felt, because feeling it is the only way to understand what it means that the practical solution to this problem didn't change between Nefertari's workshop in 1550 BCE and this particular morning in rural England. A span of 2,700 years, in which the Roman Empire rose and fell, and the Greek world produced its philosophy, and the early Christian church built its cathedrals, and the Crusades went out and mostly came back. And through all of it, through all that human achievement and human disaster, this particular problem was managed with folded cloth. That's the number, 2,700 years. Hold it for a moment. The gap between the Eber's papyrus and Agnes's November morning is longer than the entire time between Agnes and us. Now, tonight, wherever you are. The longhouse is dark when she wakes. This is a different dark from Nefertari's dark. This dark has texture because this dark has cold in it. English November, cold at 3 in the morning, is a physical presence, not just an absence of warmth. It pushes in from the walls and the thatched roof and the beaten earth floor, and only retreats from the immediate vicinity of the fire pit, which still has embers in it, small orange eyes in the dark. Agnes can see them. She orients by them. The long house. And you need to picture this properly. It's not a house in the way you're imagining. It's one large rectangular space, maybe 50 feet long, with the family living area at one end and the animal stalls at the other. The wall between them is not a full wall. It's a partial division, a low structure of straw and wattle that creates the suggestion of separation more than actual separation. The reason is the heat. The cattle and the 2 pigs and the chickens that shelter inside generate warmth, and that warmth travels. And in an English November without any form of insulation beyond thick walls and a deep thatch roof, the heat of animals is not nothing, it's survival arithmetic. This means the smell of the longhouse is always the smell of animals. Not overpoweringly, not unpleasantly to Agnes, who has lived with this smell since birth, but it is always there. The particular warm vegetable dung smell of cattle in an enclosed space. The sharp smell of the pigs, the scratchy, dusty smell of the chickens in their corner. Layered under all of this, the smell of the fire, wood smoke, ash, the particular smell of English wood burning, which is not the clean resin smell of pine, but a denser, more complex smell that depends on what you're burning, oak or ash or alder, whatever came off the common land that week. And underneath everything else, the smell of people, of straw, of damp wool, of a household existing. The children are asleep, all 4 of them in a heap near the fireside, sharing blankets, sharing warmth. Agnes can see the shape of them without seeing details. 4 small forms pressed together like animals themselves, which is essentially what they are at this hour. Small warm creatures doing what warm creatures do in the cold, conserving heat by proximity. Her husband Robert is still sleeping. He'll be up within the hour because the ploughing starts today if the ground isn't too hard. And finding out whether the ground is too hard means going outside and probing it before the light is good, which means Robert's morning starts even earlier than Agnes's in the November ploughing weeks. Agnes gets up. She's 34 years old, which in 1163 is not young. The average life expectancy numbers you might have heard quoted are dragged down by childhood mortality in ways that make them misleading about adult life. Plenty of women live to 50 or 60, but 34 is not young either, and Agnes's body on a cold morning knows this. Her back, when she straightens up from the sleeping mat, runs its usual assessment. Her knees, descending to the floor to tend the fire, report their own opinions. She is strong, the kind of strong that comes from physical labour every day of an adult life. But strong and painless are 2 different things. The fire first. Always the fire first. In this life, in this season. She takes the iron poker, her one truly irreplaceable domestic tool, the thing that if it were lost would require a trip to the nearest blacksmith, and money she doesn't have, and she stirs the embers, blows on them with a focused breath, close in, the kind of breath that has oxygen in it, not air. The embers glow brighter. She adds the smallest twigs from the pile kept dry near the fire, tiny dry things, the kindling before the kindling, the ones that catch most easily and hold the flame just long enough for the slightly bigger pieces to catch. She's been managing fire since she was 6 years old. This takes 2 minutes. The animals stir when the light improves. The cattle shift. The pigs make their pig sounds, the particular grunting inquiry of pigs who have noticed that someone is awake and wonder if that means food. It does not mean food yet, not for them, and honestly barely for Agnes. Breakfast in this house on a working morning is bread from yesterday, kept near the fire to stop it going completely stone cold, and a cup of ale weak enough to be essentially flavoured water, because the water from the nearest reliable source is safer with fermentation than without. Not every morning has even this. Some mornings are harder. This is one of the managed mornings. Agnes knows her own cycle with the accuracy that comes from paying close attention to your own body for 20 years, because your body is your most important tool, and you can't afford to be caught unprepared. She prepared last night. The rags, and she calls them that in her own mind, in the plain English of her own time. She doesn't use a polite word because there is no polite word in her vocabulary for this. There's just the rag, and the arrangement and the fact of the matter are in place, and she checks them now with the quick assessment of experience, and then she moves on to the next thing, because there are always next things. The physical work of her morning is hard. Not dramatically hard in the way that makes good stories, just continuously, patiently hard, the way most physical labour is. The animals need tending. The water needs fetching. from a well that's not far but that is outside in the cold, and the bucket is heavy and the path is uneven and the mud this morning has a skin of frost on it that is beautiful in the way dangerous things are beautiful before you've stepped on them. She steps carefully. The frost cracks under her boot. The mud below is soft and pulls at her soul. She pumps the water, which is cold enough to make her hands ache immediately, and she carries it back, and she does this 3 times because animals drink more than you expect and the household needs its share too. By the time Robert is up, the fire is going properly and there's water heating for the morning ale, and the children are beginning to show signs of consciousness, the particular stirring of small bodies reluctantly separating from sleep and warmth. Agnes moves between all of this the way she moves through everything, efficiently, without unnecessary motion, without drama. This is economy of movement born from a life where every action costs something and the account is always tight. The church is the centre of this village. The priest is a man named Father Edmund, who is neither very good nor very bad at his job, who says the masses and hears the confessions and blesses the fields in spring, and buries the dead when needed, and who has, as we mentioned, essentially nothing practical to offer the women of this parish on the subject we're discussing tonight, except the instruction to avoid the church on those days, which is less an instruction than an assumption, less about what women should do than about what the building's sanctity requires. Agnes goes to church on her days when she calculates the risk is acceptable. She is not a rebellious woman. She's not making a theological statement. She's making the same pragmatic calculation that every woman in her situation makes. The social cost of absence against the practical concerns of attendance, and choosing, morning by morning, which cost is smaller. The village has no physician. The nearest physician is in the nearest town, which is half a day's walk, and physicians in this era cost money and are primarily used for emergencies, not for the ongoing management of daily life. What the village has is what every village has: accumulated knowledge held by the women who have been here longest. The oldest women know things. Not all of what they know is useful, and not all of what they know is accurate. This is the era of the doctrine of signatures and sympathetic magic and herbal remedies that work and herbal remedies that absolutely do not work and are sometimes actively harmful. But the practical knowledge, the body knowledge, the knowledge about how to manage the facts of female life, that knowledge is here, in the women who have been doing this longest, in the conversation that happens when women work together and the subject arises obliquely and the older ones share what they know. Agnes was shown at 13 by her aunt. Her mother died young, her aunt stepped in. What to do? Her aunt was not sentimental about it. She was practical in the way that poverty makes you practical about everything. Here, like this. This is how you wash it, like this. Cold water first and then hot if you have it, because hot water first sets the stain. This is how you store it. This is the arrangement that holds best when you're doing heavy work. You'll figure out what works for you. That was it. That was the instruction. It contained no historical context, no reference to ancient texts, no connection to the knowledge existing somewhere in monastery libraries and copied Greek texts. Just here, like this. This is how you manage. It's enough for now. It has to be enough. Agnes's day extends through the morning and into the afternoon, which darkens early in November, the sun moving low across the sky and disappearing before you feel like it should be allowed to go. She feeds the children. She mends a piece of harness that Robert will need tomorrow. She goes with the other women of the village to the common ground where the washing is done on the day that the washing is done, a day determined by custom and the availability of water and fire, and the labour of the women who do this collectively. Because it's easier collectively. Everything in this village is done collectively because everything in this village is done at the margin of what is possible. And collective effort is what makes the impossible merely very hard. The washing day conversation is the conversation of women who have spent their lives in proximity, who have helped each other through childbirth and sickness, and the deaths of children, and the deaths of husbands, and the seasons of bad harvests when everyone was hungry, who know each other at the cellular level. The conversation covers everything and nothing, and the particular code of it is the code that Agnes has spoken since childhood, the shorthand of a community so small that everyone knows everyone's business, and the social courtesy is to pretend otherwise. The rags get washed with the other washing. Nobody comments. The older women's eyes register and look away. The younger women observe and absorb. Information transfers without language, without text, without any of the official channels that the men who write history use to transmit knowledge. This is also transmission. It counts. Winter comes. The days get shorter and colder. Christmas passes with the particular combination of religious celebration and simple food that characterizes a poor medieval village Christmas. Better food than usual, not good food by any other standard, but more of it, and with a degree of festiveness that matters psychologically when most of the other days don't have festiveness. Spring, the fields again, the ploughing, the planting, the grinding physical labour of agricultural England, in which the bodies of women and children and men are all required and all used without much ceremony. Summer. The heat. Relative. English summer is not Egyptian summer, not by a long measure, but you would not call it nothing. The light lasting until nearly 10 at night. The disorienting length of an English summer day if you've only known temperate climates, the way the sky holds colour long after you feel it should have given up. Agnes manages, month to month, with what she has, with the knowledge she has, with the rags that get washed and dried and folded and kept in the particular place she keeps them, the same place for 15 years. Her oldest daughter turns 13 this summer. In the autumn, Agnes sits with her and shows her. Here, like this. This is how you wash it. Cold water first. This is the arrangement. You'll figure out what works for you. The information continues through hands, through the female chain. 2,700 years from Nefertari to Agnes. Another 800 years before anything meaningfully changes. The arithmetic of human inertia. The arithmetic of who gets to decide what problems are worth solving. We're moving forward now. Faster. Because we need to spend time with Mary Cooper in Manchester, and her story is worth more than we gave it. Manchester, 1835. The cotton mill. Let me tell you what the loom room actually sounds like. Because if you haven't been in a room with working power looms, and you almost certainly haven't, because there aren't many places where you can experience this anymore, you genuinely cannot imagine it from a description. It is not just loud, it is loud in a way that removes a category. You're not in the presence of very loud sound. You're in the presence of something that has replaced the ordinary acoustic environment with something else entirely. Every loom in the room is a separate percussion instrument, and the room contains dozens of looms, and they are not synchronized. They overlap and compound each other, the metal and wood of the machines striking and returning and striking again, and this is happening at roughly the same frequency as a heartbeat, but louder than a heartbeat, by a factor that your body registers as something between music and threat. Mary Cooper has worked in this sound since she was 9 years old. She doesn't hear it the way you would hear it. She hears the variations in it, the slightly different sound of a loom running slightly wrong, the sound that precedes a thread break, the sound of a bobbin running low. She hears the loom room the way a musician hears an orchestra, as information, as pattern, as something that speaks to her through long familiarity. This morning she stands at her assigned pair of looms. You tend 2 looms simultaneously, which is the standard assignment, moving between them as each requires attention. And she watches the thread, and she watches the shuttle, and she watches the cloth accumulating on the beam, and her hands move with the assurance of someone who has done this 10,000 times, and will do it 10,000 more. Her hands. It is worth stopping on her hands. They are 22 years old, and they look older. The particular older that cotton work produces. The skin is dry because the cotton pulls moisture from whatever it touches. The fingertips have the characteristic texture of people who work constantly with thread, slightly roughened on specific surfaces. The pad of the index finger and the inside of the thumb, where the thread passes and passes and passes. There's a nick on her left palm from 2 weeks ago that hasn't fully healed, because it doesn't get time to fully heal. It just closes enough to stop being a problem and then reopens and closes again. Her nails are kept short because long nails catch on thread and cause breaks. And a thread break costs time, and time costs money, and money is the only reason she's here. She doesn't earn a great deal of money. By 1835, adult women in cotton mills earn about 6 or 7 shillings a week, which sounds like nothing because it is, in absolute terms, not much. But it's more than nothing. It's the difference between the boarding house room she shares with 3 women and sleeping outside. It's bread every day, meat once a week if nothing goes wrong. It's the clogs on her feet, which she bought herself, which are hers, the first thing she has ever owned that is fully hers and not shared with anyone. The mill floor is supervised by an overseer named Arkwright, not the famous one, a nephew or a cousin, or someone who inherited the name and a position at the mill along with it. A compact man with close-set eyes, who walks the floor at irregular intervals and makes notes on a small board he carries. He's not a monster. He's not a hero either. He is a function of the system he operates within, a system in which the productivity of the looms is the primary variable, and everything else, the women who tend them, their health, their comfort, their basic human needs, is secondary to that variable. When I say secondary, I mean secondary in the specific way that means not considered, not cruel, not intentionally disregarded, just not present in the calculation. The calculation is how many yards of cloth per shift. The variables that affect this are thread quality, machine maintenance, worker speed, and accuracy. Everything else is invisible because it's invisible. The biological realities of the workers are invisible. Their hunger at mid-morning is invisible. Their thirst. The mill is dry, cotton dry. The moisture-reducing effect of all that fibre working on the air and the workers simultaneously, and the women's mouths are always slightly dry. Their thirst is invisible. The pain in their lower backs from standing is invisible. And the monthly reality is most invisible of all, because naming it would require the mill floor to have a vocabulary for it. And the mill floor is Arkwright's floor, and Arkwright does not have that vocabulary, and would not use it if he did. So what Mary Cooper has on this particular morning is what she prepared last night, knowing this morning was coming, knowing her own body's calendar. The arrangement, as we called it for Agnes, a rag arrangement that she secured this morning in her room at the boarding house before she walked to the mill. It will need attention before the midday break. She knows this. She's factored it into the morning the way she factors in everything that needs factoring, quietly, in the back of her mind, running alongside the main task of keeping the looms running. The midday break is 30 minutes in which she eats something. She's brought a bit of bread wrapped in cloth, and uses the outdoor privy behind the mill and makes the necessary adjustments, and eats the rest of the bread and drinks some water from the communal bucket that appears during break times and is gone again when break ends. 30 minutes to address everything the body requires before 4 more hours of standing at the looms. This is fine. This is managed. This is the calculation in real time, and Mary Cooper is expert at it. What is not fine, what is never fine, and never becomes fine, is the cotton dust. Because the cotton dust is doing something to her lungs that she can't feel happening, and won't fully understand until it's too late to matter. Every breath she takes in this room contains microscopic fibre fragments. Some of them her body's defences catch. Some of them get through, settle in the deep tissue of the lungs, cause the slow, small inflammation that over years becomes the disease they'll eventually name bisonosis, brown lung, the occupational lung disease of cotton workers. Mary Cooper doesn't know any of this. She coughs because everyone coughs. She thinks it's normal. She thinks of it the way she thinks of cold and hunger and tired feet, as the weather conditions of her life, not as damage being done. After her shift, walking back to the boarding house in the particular Manchester evening, which is dark by 5 in November, and smells of coal smoke from 1,000 chimneys all combusting at once, she passes the gin shops. They're everywhere in this part of the city. The cellar shops with their hand-lettered signs and the steps going down into the light and the warmth that isn't really warmth, just less cold, and the sound of people who are trying to get to the other side of the evening as quickly as possible. She doesn't go in. She's made a decision which is actually her mother's decision transmitted to her, which is that gin is for people who have given up, and she has not given up. She goes to the pub on Fridays. She has her pint of ale. That's the limit. It's a principled limit, not a sentimental one. She's seen too many mill workers lose their wages to gin before they ever make it back to the boarding house. Seen too many women spending the cold of February without coal because the gin got there first. She gets home. She eats whatever the landlady has left on the fire. She goes upstairs. She sleeps the sleep of a body that has stood for 12 hours and absorbed 12 hours of industrial noise and would like, please, to be somewhere else for a while, which sleep provides. Tomorrow is the same. The day after is the same. The arithmetic of her life, added up across the years, is work, eat, sleep, work, eat, sleep, with Sunday as the one different day. And Sunday's difference is only the absence of the mill, not the presence of anything better, because Sunday in a Manchester boarding house in 1835 is not a day of leisure in any meaningful sense. It's a day of catching up on everything that couldn't be done during the 6-day working week. The practical management of menstruation in this context, we keep coming back to this because we have to keep coming back to this. It's the thread running through the whole story. It's the point. The practical management in this context is harder than anything Agnes faced, because Agnes was at least in a domestic space she controlled. Mary is in an industrial space that controls her. Agnes could step outside when she needed to. Mary has 2 windows. Agnes's work had a rhythm she could influence. Mary's looms don't care what's happening to Mary, and this will be true for millions of women over the next 50 years, as industrialization spreads from Lancashire to Yorkshire to Pennsylvania to Saxony to Osaka, pulling women into factory systems that have no provisions for their bodies. that treat them as productive units rather than as biological organisms with needs that don't pause for production schedules. The wood pulp material from Civil War bandages is still 3 decades away. The commercial pad is still 60 years away. The tampon that Mary Cooper's great-niece will eventually use is still 100 years away. Mary Cooper gets through it, with rags and determination, and the absolute silence that her situation demands, not the silence of shame exactly, but the silence of knowing that speaking would change nothing and would cost something. She's very good at this silence. She has been practicing it since she was 9. Now, the invention. Now we go to Denver, Colorado, and we spend time there, because the story of how this thing got made and sold is as interesting as any of the stories we've told tonight, and it hasn't been told properly yet. Earle Cleveland Haas was born in 1888 in a small town in Indiana, and he became a doctor the way men of his generation and background became doctors, through a combination of formal education and the particular kind of practical empiricism that comes from being a general practitioner in a community where you're the only physician for miles and you have to deal with whatever comes through your door. He moved to Denver in the 1920s. He had a practice there. He was, by all accounts, a thoughtful physician, someone who thought about problems rather than just applying existing solutions. The story of how he came to think about this particular problem has a few versions, as the stories of inventions usually do. The version that appears most often is that his wife, Gertrude Haas, found the external pad she was using to be uncomfortable and said so, and that Earle Haas, being the kind of physician who listened when his wife described a medical discomfort, started thinking about whether there was something better. Another version involves a friend who mentioned using a small sponge internally, which triggered the same question. The sponge version is interesting because it connects back to the long history of improvised internal solutions. The same basic principle Hippocrates described, the same basic principle that women in various cultures had been discovering and rediscovering privately for centuries. Whatever the origin, Haas started working on a design. He was thinking like an engineer, which is actually the right way to think about this problem. What are the requirements? The device needs to be comfortable. It needs to be reliably absorbent. It needs to be easy to insert without a physician's help, which means it needs some kind of insertion mechanism. It needs to be removable, which means a cord. It needs to maintain its shape under use. It needs to be made of materials that are safe in contact with mucous membranes. He worked on this for months. The prototype he developed uses compressed cotton, which is the best natural absorbent material available, and which has the advantage of being familiar to the body in the sense that it's made of the same basic substance as clothing. The insertion device, this is the part that's genuinely clever, is 2 cardboard tubes, one inside the other, so that you can push the inner tube to advance the device into position without direct contact. This is the applicator design that has remained essentially unchanged since 1929. The basic mechanical concept, 2 nested tubes, pushed to advance, is still in the box you can buy at any pharmacy tonight. He filed his patent on November the 19th, 1931. The patent number was 1,926,900. In the patent application, he described the device as a catamenial device, which is the medical Latin for menstrual, using the technical vocabulary because the patent application is a legal document, and legal documents can use technical vocabulary in ways that newspapers and advertisements cannot. The device is described in careful engineering language. Its dimensions, its materials, its mechanical action, its method of use. He then spent 2 years trying to sell the patent and mostly failing. 2 years. This is important. The man who invented the modern tampon spent 2 years unable to find a buyer because the commercial environment in the early 1930s was not configured to receive this product. He approached pharmaceutical companies. He approached personal care companies. He got meetings, some of them, and in those meetings he described the device and its purpose, and the people across the table nodded and said they'd need to think about it, and then they thought about it, and they decided that the marketing problem, the inability to say directly what the product was and what it was for, made the commercial prospect too uncertain. Haas was eventually willing to sell the patent outright, give up the rights entirely in exchange for a cash payment and royalties. He wanted enough money to fund a trip to Europe with his wife. That was his stated goal, the European trip. Gertrude Tendrich paid him $32,000 and a royalty arrangement. She was a businesswoman in Denver. The details of her prior business experience are patchy in the historical record, which is frustrating because she's the person in this story who deserves more attention than she's received. What we know is that she saw the patent, she understood the product, she understood the market, and she decided to act. The Tampax Sales Corporation started in her apartment. The machine she used initially were sewing machines that she acquired and modified. The first tampons she made were made by hand, with these modified machines, in the rooms where she lived. We have some production records from this period. She was making tampons in small batches, selling them through a small number of pharmacies and through direct mail, keeping careful track of sales. Let me tell you about those first few months, because this is not a glamorous story. This is not a story of an inventor in a well-funded laboratory with institutional support. This is a woman alone in an apartment in Denver, Colorado in 1933, which was the deepest part of the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in American history, making a product by hand that she couldn't fully describe in advertising because the social code wouldn't allow the description, and trying to sell it to a market that didn't know they needed it. The apartment smells of cotton, of the sizing solution used in the manufacturing process, of the cardboard of the packaging. It smells like a small-scale production facility, which is what it is. The machines, the modified sewing machines and the compressing equipment she's figured out how to rig for this purpose, take up most of the available space. The materials are stacked against one wall. The finished product is boxed and stacked against another. Tendrich works long days. She has to, because she's doing everything. The manufacturing, the business correspondence, the negotiations with pharmacies about stocking the product, the development of the advertising. The advertising is the particular challenge. She needs to tell women what this product is and why they should want it without using any of the words that would make the message clear and direct. She lands on language about freedom, about activity, about the modern woman who doesn't allow her monthly cycle to restrict her life. The ads show women in tennis whites, women swimming, women cycling. The implication is precise, and the language is vague, and this combination is the only available option. She also, and this is genuinely smart, sends the product to physicians, to gynecologists specifically. Because if the physician recommends it, the woman doesn't need to be sold it through advertising. The physician's recommendation carries authority. The physician's endorsement converts the product from something mysterious and slightly alarming into something medically validated. Some physicians were enthusiastic. Some were skeptical in the ways we described earlier. The concern about unmarried women, the confusion of medical judgment with cultural assumptions. Tendrich focused on the enthusiastic ones. She sent them samples. She sent them literature. She solicited testimonials. She built a medical endorsement infrastructure that she could use in her advertising. It worked. Slowly, but it worked. By 1936, the Tampax Sales Corporation had enough revenue to move out of the apartment and into an actual small manufacturing facility. By 1937, a second brand, Wicks, had entered the market, which meant there was now competition, which meant there was now a market. By 1940, tampon use was growing steadily, and the advertising was getting slightly more direct. Not honest in any absolute sense, still completely coded, but coded more efficiently, the implication clearer, the consumer understanding better established. Gertrude Tendrich sold the business in 1936. She sold it to a group of investors who took the company national and eventually took it public. She made money from the sale. The exact amount is not well documented, and she stepped out of the story, which is why you've probably never heard of her. The company she built is still one of the largest tampon manufacturers in the world. The patent she bought for $32,000 became the basis for an industry worth billions of dollars. She had a sewing machine in an apartment in Denver during the Depression, and she bet everything on this. She was right. And we don't know what happened to her after she sold the business. We don't know where she died or when. We have her in the historical record for about 3 years, during which she built something significant, and then we don't have her anymore. This is the pattern we've been seeing all night. Women making essential contributions to the history of this particular problem, and then disappearing from the record while what they built persists. Nefertari's hands on the loom, Lysistrate walking home through the Kerameikos, Agnes by the fire, Mary Cooper at the spinning frame, Gertrude Tendrich at her modified sewing machine. The chain of women who passed knowledge to each other without writing it down. The nurses who noticed what Civil War bandage material could do. The woman on Kathleen's shift at Boeing who mentioned in the locker room that she'd been using tampons for years and it worked. All of them connected. All of them mostly not in the history books. Their contributions persist in ways that are harder to trace than the contributions of people who got their names on the patent. But they persist. Now 1980 again. And we're going to stay longer this time because the TSS story has details that matter. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, is not a glamorous institution in the way that some government agencies are. It occupies office buildings and laboratory buildings in the Druid Hills neighborhood of Atlanta, and it does its work, the surveillance of disease, the investigation of outbreaks, the analysis of public health data, in the methodical, unglamorous way of public health bureaucracies, which is to say mostly correctly and usually invisibly. In the fall of 1979, a group of physicians from different states began noticing something strange. Not a lot of cases, just a handful, scattered across the country, not connected at first glance. Young women, primarily menstruating, presenting with a constellation of symptoms: high fever, a sunburn-like rash on the palms and soles, low blood pressure, confusion, nausea. Lab tests showing multi-organ involvement, liver, kidneys, muscles. Cultures finding Staphylococcus aureus. Individual physicians, seeing one case, don't necessarily connect it to anything, but the CDC has a system for this. The epidemic intelligence officers, the surveillance network, the standardized reporting, and the system is designed to see patterns that individual physicians can't see. By early 1980, the pattern is becoming visible. The cases cluster. The clustering is not random. The risk factors are not random. The association with menstruation appears. The association with tampon use appears. The CDC publishes its first report in May 1980. 55 cases identified through the surveillance system, predominantly female, predominantly occurring during menstruation. Tampon use in the majority of cases. They call it toxic shock syndrome, and they flag it as a public health concern under investigation. By June, the case count is higher. The analysis is more refined. Specific tampon brands are being looked at. The Rely tampon begins to emerge from the data as the association grows stronger. Not the only brand, but the one with the clearest statistical signal. The CDC epidemiologist working the investigation is a man named Bruce Dan, and he is trying to do a clean epidemiological case control study, which means take the sick women, take a matched group of similar women who are not sick, compare everything you can compare between them, what they eat, what they wear, what medications they take, what products they use, and what they use for menstrual management. The data is unambiguous in a way that good epidemiology rarely is so quickly. Women who have TSS are dramatically more likely to have been using Rely than women without TSS. The association is strong. It's consistent across geographic areas. It holds up under multiple types of statistical analysis. In September 1980, the CDC is ready to act. The FDA is ready to act. Procter & Gamble is informed. The week that follows involves negotiations that we can only partly reconstruct from public documents and subsequent accounts. Procter & Gamble's position, and this is worth understanding, not because it excuses anything, but because it explains the mechanics of what happened, is that they have data suggesting Rely is no more dangerous than other tampons, that the TSS association may reflect behavioural differences in Rely users rather than anything inherent to the product, and that pulling a major product off the market based on a correlation study rather than a demonstrated mechanism is premature. The CDC's position is that the correlation is strong enough to constitute a public health emergency, and that waiting for a demonstrated mechanism while women are getting sick and dying is not acceptable practice. Procter & Gamble withdraws Rely from the market on September 22, 1980. They describe it as a voluntary decision to support research into TSS. They do not admit that the product caused the illness. In their press materials, they frame it as a responsible corporate decision to remove uncertainty rather than as an admission of fault. The mechanism, when it's eventually worked out, involves the specific materials in Rely and the way they change the internal environment. Highly absorbent materials, particularly the polyester foam beads, increase oxygen levels and alter chemical conditions in ways that favour toxin production by Staphylococcus aureus. The same property that made the tampon more absorbent, that seemed like an improvement, created conditions where a common bacterium produced a toxin it doesn't normally produce at dangerous levels. This is not a simple story of corporate wrongdoing, though there are legitimate criticisms of how P&G handled it. It's a story about a technology that outpaced its own safety testing, about a regulatory gap that allowed a significantly new product to be released without the rigour that the novelty warranted, about the difficulty of identifying low-frequency but serious adverse events before they aggregate into a visible pattern. It's also a story about silence, because the silence that has surrounded menstrual products since 1896, the inability to describe them honestly in public communication, slowed the dissemination of the safety warnings. Newspapers that had been reluctant to run tampon advertisements were now required to run tampon safety warnings, and the vocabulary required for those warnings was vocabulary that had not been used in public before, and some editors handled it better than others, and the result was that the information about the danger reached different women at different speeds, depending on which newspapers they read and how their local media navigated the vocabulary problem. Some women got sick because they hadn't heard the warning yet. Some women got sick because they heard the warning and dismissed it as overstated. Some women got sick because they had the product at home and didn't connect it to the news story they'd half heard. Some women got sick because everything happened too fast. The disease moved faster than the warning. Linda Remmers in Cincinnati was one of those women. She was sick before she knew to stop. She recovered. Others didn't. The TSS outbreak kills at least 38 women and sickens hundreds more between 1978 and 1980. The long-term health consequences for survivors vary widely. Some complete recoveries, some permanent damage, some women who will tell you 20 years later that they still feel the places the illness touched. The regulatory changes that follow are real. The FDA classification of tampons as medical devices with testing requirements is real. The absorbency standardization is real. The warning label is real. None of these things were present before 1980. All of them came from the crisis. What also came from the crisis is a shift in the public conversation. The elaborate linguistic codes of the prior century, the blue liquid, the feminine hygiene, the total circumlocution, those codes don't disappear overnight, but they crack. The mainstream media has now used the words tampon and menstruation and vaginal in news coverage, in headlines, in broadcast reporting, because they had to, because a public health emergency required it. And having done it once, having survived the doing of it, the door is open a little wider, not fully open. The blue liquid in tampon commercials persist for decades. The category euphemism feminine hygiene persists to this day. But something shifts. Some portion of the centuries-old silence about this topic breaks open permanently. This is what crises sometimes do. They force the language that normal circumstances won't allow. And now we're almost at tonight, almost at you. But not quite. We need to stop in a few more places first, because the story doesn't end with the Relay recall. The story continues, as stories about women's bodies and women's choices always continue, because the structural conditions that created the problem don't change overnight, just because one particular crisis forced a conversation. The tampon tax. You may have heard about this. If you haven't, here's the situation. In most of the world, consumer products are subject to sales tax, but governments have historically exempted certain categories of goods from sales tax on the basis that those goods are essential necessities. Food is usually exempt in countries that have sales taxes. Medicines are usually exempt. Basic clothing in some places. The logic is that taxing basic necessities puts a regressive burden on people who have less money. Menstrual products, tampons, pads, other period management products have historically been taxed as non-essential luxury goods in a majority of countries. Not everywhere, and not consistently, and this is changing. But the baseline position for most of the 20th century in most of the world was that menstrual products were taxable luxury items. The argument that they are luxury items, that a person who menstruates choosing to manage that menstruation with purchased products is making an optional consumer choice that warrants taxation the way a yacht purchase warrants taxation. This argument requires a specific kind of willful blindness about what these products actually are and who actually needs them. It requires ignoring the monthly reality of menstruation in a way that has been quite comfortable for governments made up primarily of people who don't menstruate. The campaign to end the tampon tax has been ongoing since the 1990s. Canada repealed its tax on menstrual products in 2015. The UK repealed theirs in 2021, after a decades-long campaign that had to fight the argument, made with apparently sincere commitment by some officials, that tampons and pads were indeed luxury goods. Australia, Germany, Ireland, and a growing number of American states have moved to eliminate or reduce the tax. Many countries still have it. Period poverty. This is the term for the situation in which people who menstruate cannot afford the products they need to manage menstruation, either because the products are too expensive, or because the products are taxed in ways that put them out of reach, or because the products are simply unavailable in the region where they live. Period poverty affects approximately 500 million people worldwide, by recent estimates. It's not a small problem. It causes girls and women to miss school and work. It causes people to use inadequate substitutes, materials that don't work as well, that cause infections that limit mobility and activity. The practical consequences are enormous: educational disruption, economic participation limits, health impacts. In Scotland, a law passed in 2020 makes menstrual products free in public buildings, schools, libraries, community centres. In England, a programme has distributed free products in schools since 2019. These are not old programmes. These are happening right now. The blue liquid is still in the advertisements. On American television in 2024, a tampon commercial cannot show anything that looks like blood. The fluid being demonstrated in absorption tests must be blue. The product must be described without reference to what is actually being absorbed. The vocabulary of menstruation is allowed in some contexts now, in health education, in journalism, in social media, with fewer restrictions than broadcast. But the advertising standards for menstrual products still maintain the same basic architecture of circumlocution that Gertrude Tendrich was navigating in her Denver apartment in 1933. This is 90 years of the blue liquid. 90 years of not being allowed to show what the product is for, while those products are being taxed in many jurisdictions as luxury items. While period poverty affects hundreds of millions of people, while the regulatory framework that protects users from another TSS-level disaster is still being argued over in legislatures, the history is not over, the silence is not fully broken. The problem that Nefertari was managing in her Theban workshop in 1550 BCE is still, in specific ways, a problem that is managed with less institutional support than it deserves. But here's what has changed. Everything we've talked about tonight that has changed. The disposable materials, the commercial products, the internal option, the regulatory framework, the public conversation, the campaigns against the tampon tax, the period poverty programs, the legal protections in Scotland. All of it came from women naming the problem, insisting the problem was real, refusing the silence, sometimes quietly, in boarding house rooms and nursing stations and Boeing locker rooms, sometimes loudly, in legislative chambers and courtrooms and public health investigations. The information kept flowing through informal female networks for most of history, through whatever channels were available, around every obstacle that was placed in the way. That's the human story underneath the product story, the insistence on transmitting necessary information about bodies and how to care for them, against the resistance of every institution that would rather not discuss it. It's a long insistence. It's still going. And now, finally, we can let the night come in. You've been here a while. You've travelled a significant distance, from the Nile to Cincinnati, from papyrus to polyester foam, from the medical text that no one was allowed to read to the warning labels that no one was supposed to need. Let it settle now. The way information settles, when you stop actively processing it and let it find its level in the deeper places where things are stored. The world outside is doing what it always does at this hour, whatever your hour is, whatever your latitude, whatever the season outside your window or your wall, or the curtain between you and the dark. The sounds are quieting, or they've been quiet for a while, and you're only noticing now. Your breathing is different from the beginning of this story. Slower, less deliberate. Your chest rises and falls with less thought involved. Your body is doing the thing bodies do when they're allowed to. Return to the rhythm they were made for. Nefertari's hands are resting. The loom is still. The Nile carries on outside the window, as it has for 10,000 years before her and will for thousands after, indifferent and necessary and beautiful in a way that doesn't care whether you appreciate the beauty. Lysistrate is home. The children are asleep. The sound of the keramakos at night, which is less than the day but never nothing, comes through the walls. Flavia's bakery oven is cold for the night. The flour dust has settled. Agnes's fire has banked itself to embers. The longhouse breathes. The animals breathe. The English night is doing what English nights do, being damp and dark and full of the particular sounds of the countryside at rest. Mary Cooper is on her share of the mattress. The mills outside have changed shifts but haven't stopped. They're always running, the great mechanical heartbeat of Manchester going through the night. She doesn't hear it anymore, not consciously. It's the background condition of her existence, as familiar as her own pulse. Kathleen has written her letter. It's sealed on the table. The Boeing plant is 3 miles away and its lights are on because they're always on, building aircraft that her husband might someday fly over and her children might someday learn about in school. She doesn't know this. She knows she's tired and she did good work today and she wrote to her husband and she is warm enough. Linda Remmers is home from the hospital. The fever is gone. Her body is doing the long, quiet work of recovery. The rebuilding that happens without announcement, cell by cell, the restoration of what the illness took. She'll be back in her classroom in 2 weeks. The 4th graders have been asking about her. Her colleague told her this, and it made her cry a little, which embarrassed her, which was unnecessary. All of them resting, all of them here, and you. You know things now that you didn't know at the beginning of this evening. You know the Ebers papyrus. You know the name Gertrude Tendrich. You know what the blue liquid means and how long it's been blue. You know that Earle Haas wanted to go to Europe with his wife and sold a patent that became a global industry for $32,000, and the trip happened presumably and was probably nice. You know that for 2,700 years, from ancient Egypt to medieval England, the practical solution to this monthly problem didn't materially change. Folded cloth. That's the technology. 2,700 years of folded cloth, because the medical knowledge that described something better existed in texts that didn't reach the women who needed them, in a world organised around who was allowed to know things and who wasn't. You know that the solution, when it finally came through women making the connection themselves, through nurses in field hospitals noticing that bandage material worked better than cloth, through Gertrude Tendrich looking at a patent and seeing something the companies said no to, through women in locker rooms and boarding houses and domestic kitchens passing the information, through the channels that were available because the official channels weren't. You know that the crisis that finally broke the public silence was a crisis that hurt people, that the progress bought by the 1980 TSS outbreak was bought at a cost that nobody should have had to pay, that was paid because the silence prevented the safety information that might have prevented the deaths from being distributed properly. You know all of this now, and knowing it, tonight you can put it down. The weight of it, the injustice of it, the sadness of it, which is real, which is allowed, which is not the same as despair. You can put it down because it's not yours to carry right now. It belongs to history, which is where we've been, and history is a good place for heavy things. History can hold them. History has been holding them for 4,000 years. What's yours right now is the pillow under your head, the weight of the blanket, the specific temperature of the room you're in, which your body has calibrated to without your instruction, the specific sounds that are so familiar you've stopped hearing them, which means they become part of the acoustic weather of your life, as unremarkable and as constant as your own pulse. Let your shoulders go. If you haven't let them go yet, and most people, reading or listening at this hour, are still holding tension in their shoulders that they don't know they're holding, let them drop, down away from your ears, down toward the mattress, toward the floor, toward the earth that is under all of us, all the time, and which will hold us without effort for as long as we need it to. Your hands are somewhere, on the blanket, or on the pillow, or resting on your chest. Let them be wherever they are. Let the fingers uncurl. Hands are designed for gripping, and they will grip without your permission if you don't consciously release them. Release them. Let the fingers find their natural, slightly curled rest, the position they arrive at when they're not being asked to do anything. The breath. In, out, in, out. There is nothing you have to do with the breath. It knows what it's doing. It's been doing this since the first moment of your life, in the dark of an earlier room, and it's learned the job well. It doesn't need supervision. Somewhere out there, tonight, in all the places where people are dealing with all the ordinary remarkable things of being human, the history we've covered is being lived by people who don't know its history. People solving this month's version of a problem that is 4,000 years old. People who will solve it the way it's available to be solved, with what they have, the way every woman in every century has solved it with what they had. Tomorrow those people will tell someone else what worked. The chain continues. It has always continued. And underneath all the changing details, the papyrus, the wool, the rags, the cotton bandages, the commercial pads with their safety pins, the patented cylinder of compressed cotton in its cardboard applicator, the blue liquid in the advertisement, the warning label on the box. Underneath all of it, the same thing that has been true since the beginning. Bodies doing what bodies do. People figuring out how to live in those bodies. Information passing from person to person through whatever channels the world allows. The problem getting slowly, imperfectly, better. That's the story. That's actually all of history in one form or another. The lights outside, wherever you are doing what lights do at this hour. Maybe fewer of them, maybe the particular colour that streets get after midnight. Maybe you can't see any lights. Maybe there's just the dark, which is enough, which is what you need. The sounds are soft now, or softening, or you've stopped hearing the ones that are there, which is the same thing when you're this tired, warm enough, safe enough, rested enough. You have a bed, you have a blanket, you have this hour which belongs to you, which no one can take. That's more than most people in this story had. More than the women in the workshops and the factories and the field hospitals. More than the women who sold products they couldn't name through advertising that couldn't describe what it was selling. More than Linda in the hospital waiting for the fever to break. They made it through. You're making it through. We all keep making it through. That's the oldest human story. It's still going. It's still going right now. Let sleep take you the way it takes everyone eventually at the end of the long days that make up a life. Quietly, without announcement, in the space between one breath and the next, the boundary moves, and you're somewhere else, somewhere that isn't quite here and isn't quite anywhere. The place that every human who has ever lived has visited every night for the whole of human history. Nefertari went there. The Nile kept flowing while she slept. Agnes went there. The fire kept its embers. Mary Cooper went there. The mills kept running. Gertrude Tendrich went there. The machines in her apartment rested. Kathleen went there. The bombers kept getting built. Linda went there. The fever broke while she slept. Now you. Let it come. Let the thoughts slow. They want to slow. They've been working all evening and they're as tired as the rest of you. The thinking part of you that has been following this story across 4,000 years. Let it rest. The slow darkening behind the eyes. The sounds becoming something more like dreams than like sounds. The breath doing its quiet, ongoing work without any input from you at all. The world is still out there. The world is always still out there. But right now, right here, you don't need to be. Good night.